The night is still, and the stars above feel farther than usual, suspended in the velvet quiet of a forgotten sky. There's a hush in the air tonight, like history itself is holding its breath, waiting to speak in hushed tones and gentle pauses. Tonight we begin a journey not through triumphs but through shadows, soft and ancient. We will wander softly down the marble halls of empires, long fallen, and meet the women who wore the crown not as symbols of wisdom or peace, but as emblems of fear, power, and destruction. Queens whose names echo through history not with grace but with a chill. They ruled with iron, or cruelty, or chaos. Some were victims of the age, others architects of their own downfall. But all left their mark, carved deep into the stone of time. We'll explore their reigns like slow-moving rivers, calmly, respectfully, observing how ambition, fear, loss, or vengeance turned royal silk into chains. And always, gently, we'll return to one quiet truth, that power is never light, and some crowns press heavier than others. This is the story of the worst queens to ever rule. So come, let's explore history together. Your love and support truly mean the world to me. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Grab your coffee and let's get started. The morning fog that once settled over the ancient city of Luoyang has long since faded, but the memory of Wu Zetian lingers like incense in the corners of an empty palace. Born into the brilliance of China's Tang dynasty, Wu's ascent began not in a throne room, but in the quiet chambers of a concubine's quarters, where silence was survival and observation was power. She was not born to rule, but over time, through careful listening and quiet defiance, she climbed beyond every limitation that dynasty, tradition, and men had placed before her. It began slowly, a whispered word to an emperor, a knowing glance to a servant, a secret kept where others would speak. By the time she reached the height of her reign, she would be the only woman in Chinese history to claim the title of emperor in her own name. But her rule was not gentle. Wu Zetian's path was carved with the soft echo of disappearing rivals. Her ascent was marked by sudden illnesses, unexplained suicides, and the quiet burial of threats, both real and imagined. Some say she killed her own infant daughter to frame the empress and secure her rise. Others believe the act was one of calculated storytelling, a lie sharp enough to slice through courtly tradition. Either way, the legend stuck as blood often does. And yet, the people prospered under her. Roads were built, crops improved, borders held strong, education expanded. For a while, the empire gleamed like a blade newly polished, catching sunlight just before the strike. She understood control. Her court was blanketed with informants, and whispers carried weight. Those who spoke carelessly found their tongues removed, or worse, their names erased, not just from documents, but from the memory of the court itself. Even statues of former empresses were smashed and rebuilt with her own face. History, to Wu, was not something recorded. It was something written by her hand in her voice. In the grand halls of her palace, she erected the wordless stele, a monument of smooth stone, with no inscription. To some it symbolized modesty, a silence that asked future generations to judge her legacy. But others understood the deeper message, that no words could contain her, and none dared to define her. There were moments of softness, too, quiet gestures to the poor, reforms for farmers, exams for scholars. She promoted women in ways no emperor before her dared to consider. For every act of cruelty, there seemed an echo of compassion. But compassion sharpened by calculation rarely rests easy in the soul. And perhaps that was Wu's greatest skill, the art of appearing eternal. Her eyes missed little. Her mind, restless even in old age, plotted still. Advisors who lingered too long became liabilities. Family meant nothing if loyalty frayed. Even her own sons feared her, and with reason. She crowned herself not empress, but emperor. She broke the structure of gender and hierarchy in one breath, and solidified her rule with a steel grip that never loosened. She rebranded the dynasty in her own name, the Zhou dynasty. For 15 years, she ruled unchallenged, her court cloaked in silk and secrecy. But the throne, even when held firmly, can tremble beneath time. In her later years, illness slowed her, and with it the grip of her dominion began to slip. Ministers conspired. Her enemies once banished or buried found voice in whispers again, and eventually her own sons, whom she had once cast aside, returned to remove her from power. There was no rebellion, no riot, only a quiet transfer dignified by the customs of a court too exhausted for war. She died not long after. Alone, forgotten by the dynasty she helped shape, her name was buried beneath the weight of male successors eager to restore the Tang and its traditions. But history remembers her, not only as a tyrant, but as a paradox. She was brutal and brilliant, merciless and reformist, a mother who destroyed her children, a ruler who lifted peasants, a woman who took the forbidden throne, and then ruled it with a fury and focus unmatched in her time. Was she evil? Was she necessary? Perhaps both. Or perhaps, like many who ruled too long, she became what power demanded. Even now, scholars disagree on how to speak her name. Some call her a murderer in imperial robes, others, a visionary trapped in an age that punished women for ambition. But few deny her impact, and fewer still forget the shadow she cast. In the deep silence of the palace ruins, you might still feel her presence, quiet and watching, as if history itself answers to her. And as night deepens, and we close the scroll of her life, there's a final lingering question that floats gently in the air. What does it cost to be remembered? Not just known, but carved into time. Perhaps Wu Zian knew, and perhaps that is why she wore the crown, not like a symbol, but like armor. Sleep now, knowing her story has been told, not in judgment, but in quiet reflection. Let her memory drift into the long corridors of night, where power fades and peace begins. In the still corridors of the Forbidden City, where golden dragons curl across painted ceilings and silence clings to the stone, there once walked a woman who wielded power from behind silk curtains, not through titles earned, but through presence, calculated, constant, and quiet. Her name was Cixi. For nearly 5 decades, Empress Dowager Cixi ruled China, not as an empress in name, but as the veiled architect of Qing dynasty politics. She began, like many women of her time, in obscurity. Born into a middle-ranking family, she entered the imperial palace as a low-ranking concubine, but within her mind there flickered a sharpness, a precision that the court failed to see, until it was far too late. She gave birth to the emperor's only son, a singular moment that reshaped her fate. When the emperor died, her 5-year-old boy, the Tongji emperor, became a figurehead, and she became his regent. But it wasn't enough to merely advise. Cixi studied every gesture in the palace, every minister's ambition, every general's silence, and when the time was right, she stepped beyond her traditional place. Behind the yellow screens, she listened. Behind the throne, she maneuvered. When her co-regent attempted to seize more power, he disappeared from court affairs. Reforms that threatened her influence were delayed. Voices that questioned her legitimacy were silenced. Sometimes with exile, sometimes with something quieter and more final. The imperial court became her stage, and she directed it with both artistry and severity. She kept the young emperor in her shadow. His every decree filtered through her hand, and even when he reached adulthood, his autonomy was never truly his own. Cixi never released the reins, not when it suited her to hold them. Under her eye, executions became tools of guidance. She understood the language of fear. Ministers were reminded that loyalty was rewarded, and dissent dissolved. Eunuchs and spies moved silently in her service. A glance from her could reshape a province. Her silken robes may have flowed gently, but her decisions landed like stone. But her story, like many, is not one of pure cruelty. Cixi adored beauty. Her gardens bloomed with rare flowers. She loved theater, calligraphy, fine porcelain. She introduced innovations to court life, photography, telegraph lines, even steamships. She funded the restoration of the summer palace, filling it with lakes, walkways, and quiet places to think. Under her, the dynasty survived chaos, rebellion, and foreign pressure for a time. And yet it is also true that progress trembled in her presence. When whispers of reform stirred in the air, especially from the young Guangxu emperor, her nephew and another puppet under her care, she resisted. In 1898, the 100 Days Reform, a series of modernizing efforts, led by the emperor and his advisors, promised a new China, but Cixi saw in it a threat to tradition and to her control. In a swift, calculated move, she placed the emperor under house arrest and executed many of his supporters. The reforms were halted. China's future was frozen, locked behind the same silk curtains that had obscured the throne for years. To many, this marked the moment when Cixi ceased to be a guardian and became a gatekeeper, holding back a tide she could not understand. Western powers encroached, carving up the coast. Internally, rebellion smoldered. She backed the infamous Boxer Rebellion, a violent anti-foreign movement that spiraled into bloodshed. And when foreign armies invaded Beijing in retaliation, Cixi fled the palace disguised as a peasant. She returned later, diminished but unbroken, her legacy further shadowed by ruin. Still she endured. Her ability to survive, to control narrative, to remain indispensable, that was her true strength. Even at the edge of collapse, she never relinquished her vision. She appointed a new child emperor before her death, ensuring the dynasty's continuity one final time. She died in 1908, in her beloved Forbidden City, the same day the Guangxu emperor, still under her watch, died mysteriously. Whispers claimed she had him poisoned. Whether truth or fear, the rumor clung tightly to her memory, and so Cixi's name remains a puzzle in Chinese history. To some, she was a shrewd leader who protected the empire through turbulent times, navigating dynastic decay and foreign aggression with grace under pressure. To others, she was a tyrant in embroidery, a woman who strangled China's future out of fear, vanity, or personal power. She reigned not with a crown, but with command. Not with force, but with influence. Not from the throne, but from the shadows behind it. In the hush of the palace gardens, where willows lean over still waters, her reflection remains proud, untouchable, and alone. She loved China in her way. But sometimes, love expressed through control becomes indistinguishable from possession. And so, in the soft folds of history, Cixi drifts between villain and visionary. Tonight her story settles gently beside us, like incense rising from a lacquered box. Let it be a reminder that not all rulers wear their power plainly. Some rule in whispers, behind walls, behind faces, behind fear. Let us breathe now, and let the shadows return to rest. The morning mists that curl through Madagascar's highlands are thick and dreamlike, a quiet veil over red earth and dense forests, where the scent of wild orchids drifts with the breeze, and time seems reluctant to move forward. But within this stillness, a name echoes that the land has not forgotten. Ranavalona. A queen, a guardian, a tyrant. Her story, like the island itself, stands apart from the world, isolated, intense, and layered with sorrow. She rose in the early 19th century, a time when Madagascar stood at the edge of transformation. European powers were creeping closer, drawing maps and making quiet plans. Missionaries came with books and promises. Traders brought muskets and whispers. And behind the palace walls of Antananarivo, a young woman prepared herself for a role that history would never quite forget. Ranavalona was not the heir, but her father had once warned the king of a plot against his life. And in gratitude, the royal family adopted the young girl into the palace. When King Radama I died without a son, the court expected the next ruler to be drawn from the male line. But Ranavalona, sharp-eyed and utterly determined, had her own vision. She claimed the throne through swift, silent force. Allies were bribed, threats erased, and rivals quietly removed. By the time her coronation was announced, resistance had already been buried quite literally in the hills beyond the city. And so began one of the most fearsome reigns in African history. Renovalona saw herself not just as a ruler, but as a protector of tradition, a guardian of Madagascar's soul. She viewed European influence not as a gift, but as a poison. Under her command, Christian missionaries were expelled, converts were forced to recant their faith, Bibles were burned in public squares, those who resisted were thrown from cliffs, their final prayers drowned by wind and stone. It was not just religion that she fought, but change itself. Roads were left to crumble, foreign trade was throttled, schools, once vibrant under her predecessor, fell silent. In their place, she revived Fandrarona, the traditional rites of purification and ancestor worship. She declared herself the living heart of the kingdom, and all must bow. Her justice was merciless. Trials were rare. Instead, the queen relied on an ancient and brutal custom, Tanjana. Suspects were forced to drink a poison made from the Tanjana nut. If they vomited and lived, they were deemed innocent. If not, their fate was sealed. Thousands died in this way, and fear seeped into every corner of daily life. Even a careless word could become a death sentence. But her reign was not mindless cruelty. It had a logic, a terrifying one, but a logic nonetheless. Ranovalona believed that survival meant isolation. She feared that her kingdom, if open to the West, would be devoured. Better, she thought, to rule with iron and fire than see her people become subjects of a foreign crown. And in her own way she succeeded. For over 3 decades, she kept Madagascar independent, the only African kingdom to resist European colonization during her era. Her soldiers patrolled with muskets and spears. Her spies, it was said, could hear through walls. Even the French and British, despite their naval power, dared not provoke her directly. They waited, watching as the island closed itself off behind her will, but the cost was great. Her people suffered. Forced labor, known as fanampoena, became the heartbeat of her economy. Tens of thousands were conscripted to build roads or carry supplies for royal campaigns. Many died of exhaustion, hunger, or disease. Famine swept the land in the 1830s, and entire regions withered beneath her rule. By some estimates, Madagascar's population fell by nearly 1/3 during her reign. And still, she ruled. At the heart of her palace, in lacquered chambers scented with clove and wood smoke, Ranovalona dressed in silks and gold. She listened to musicians play the valiha, a bamboo harp that sang the sorrows of her people. She hosted elaborate ceremonies where dancers moved in circles as if time itself could be bent by rhythm. She received foreign envoys with sharp courtesy and sent them home puzzled, afraid, or both. There was a strange duality to her presence. Visitors described her as poised, almost elegant, and yet unpredictable. One moment warm, the next chillingly cold. A queen whose smile, they said, felt like a mask carved in stone. And then, after 33 years, she died. Not by rebellion, not by assassination, simply aid. The island exhaled. Her death marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. Her successors, less feared and more open to change, began to reintroduce foreign trade and diplomacy. But the damage had already rooted deep. By the end of the century, the French would return, not as guests, but as conquerors. The kingdom she fought to protect became a colony, and the traditions she guarded began to fade. And yet, her legacy remains difficult to define. Was she mad? Was she a patriot? Was she cruel for cruelty's sake, or merely willing to do what others could not? In Madagascar today, her memory is divided. Some call her the female Caligula, a tyrant soaked in blood. Others remember her as the Iron Queen, who held the island when no one else could, who outlasted every enemy and ruled on her own terms. Statues remain. So do legends. Perhaps the truth lies not in extremes, but in the stillness between them, in the wind that brushes the hills of Imarina, where her palace once stood, a wind that carries no answers, only echoes. Let those echoes fade for now. Let the soil rest. Let the queen, fierce, tragic, and unforgettable, return to sleep beneath the trees. In the golden halls of the Ajuda Palace, overlooking the quiet Tagus River, there once walked a queen whose footsteps grew slower with each passing year. Not from age, but from the weight of a crown worn through sorrow. Her name was Maria I of Portugal, though to many she is remembered by a more fragile title, Maria the Mad. Her story begins in light. Born in 1734, Maria Francisca Isabel grew up surrounded by tapestries, scholars, and religious devotion. Her father, King José VI, was deeply protective of her, and under his watch she was educated not only in courtly grace, but also in Latin, philosophy, and music. She was bright, eager, and full of the gentle confidence that often blooms in daughters of powerful men. But Portugal was not a peaceful land in those days. A devastating earthquake in 1755 shattered Lisbon and reshaped the kingdom, both literally and politically. Maria watched as her father handed the reins of power to the formidable Marquis of Pombal, a man of ambition and steel. Under his guidance, Portugal rebuilt with cold efficiency, but also with repression. The Jesuits were expelled. Nobles were silenced. The Inquisition was molded into a new tool of the state. Maria, deeply devout and cautious by nature, resented Pombal's influence. When she ascended the throne in 1777, after her father's death, her first act was to dismiss him, sending a clear signal that her reign would follow a different path. At first, her rule was one of quiet prosperity. She was the first queen regnant of Portugal, a rare and dignified title in a world still shaped by kings. She lowered taxes, improved education, reopened convents, and softened the harshness of her father's ministers. The people called her Maria the Pious, and her court pulsed with music, candlelight, and an earnest attempt to heal old wounds. But behind the elegance, shadows gathered. She had married her uncle, Prince Pedro, a match arranged for dynastic reasons. Their marriage was affectionate, though it bore the heavy toll of royal responsibility. 16 pregnancies, many ending in miscarriage or the death of a child. Of those who lived, only a few remained healthy. Loss became familiar. And with each tragedy, Maria's gaze grew dimmer. Then, in 1786, her beloved Pedro died. It was not a sudden death, but the slow fading of a man she had leaned on since youth. The queen broke, deeply, quietly, irreversibly. At first she withdrew from ceremonies. Then she avoided daylight altogether. Court officials noted her erratic speech, her sudden crying fits, her refusal to change clothes or eat for days. She insisted that God was punishing her. She heard voices. She claimed the souls of the dead visited her chambers at night. Her confessor wrote that she believed she was damned, not in a poetic sense but with absolute bone-deep conviction. In the years that followed, her decline became impossible to hide. Physicians from across Europe were summoned. Treatments were attempted. Herbs, bleedings, cold baths, long prayers. None helped. Eventually the court stopped pretending. Her eldest son, Prince João, was named regent. He governed quietly in her place, shielding her from public view and avoiding the questions of foreign diplomats. But Maria was still queen in name, and that name carried weight. In 1807, Napoleon's forces marched across the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, refusing to align with France, faced invasion. João made a desperate decision. He would take the royal family, including his mother, now deep in madness, and flee to Brazil. And so, across the Atlantic, they went. It was a journey of weeks, with storms battering their fleet, and the Queen's cries echoing through the lower decks. She had to be restrained at times. Her servants reported that she believed the ship was sailing into the fires of hell. They arrived in Rio de Janeiro in January 1808, a royal court in exile. Maria spent her remaining years in Brazil, far from the palaces of Lisbon, locked in a world her mind could no longer grasp. Her apartments were guarded, her windows shuttered. At times her screaming echoed down the marble corridors. At others, she simply sat in silence, unmoving, whispering to phantoms. Outside her chambers, the world changed. Prince João modernized Brazil. The colony became a thriving center of culture and trade. But within the palace, Maria remained unchanged, a ghost in royal robes, lost in prayers and shadows. She died in 1816, gently, almost quietly. After years of mental torment, her body finally gave way. She was buried in Brazil, though later returned to Portugal, her remains laid to rest in the Grand Basilica de Estrela, a church she herself had commissioned in better days. Today, her story is often told with a tinge of pity. A tragic queen, broken by grief, a devout soul, undone by sorrow. But there's more in her silence than sadness. Maria ruled with dignity while she could. Her early reforms softened the iron of her father's court. She dared to remove a powerful minister, to lead a nation with kindness. She did not fall to madness through weakness, but through the sheer weight of repeated grief, the kind no title or crown could guard against. And in that, perhaps, she becomes something more than just Maria the Mad. Perhaps she is Maria, the human, caught between two continents, 2 centuries and a mind she could not quiet. Tonight, let her rest. Let her whispers dissolve into the gentle winds of the Atlantic she once crossed. Let the heavy crown fall quietly beside her. Sleep softly, dear Queen. There is a grayness to English skies, a softness in the mist that hangs over Tudor towers and quiet stone chapels. Beneath that moody light, in the 16th century, came a queen whose reign would be written in fire. Her name was Mary, daughter of Henry, the first woman to rule England in her own right. And to history, she would forever carry a name she never chose: Bloody Mary. Mary Tudor was born into Golden Promise in 1516. Her father, King Henry, was still young, bold, and devoted to his Spanish queen, Catherine of Aragon. As the only surviving child of their union, Mary was a cherished heir, learned in languages, philosophy, music, and the scriptures. Her early life shimmered with tapestries and court musicians, surrounded by tutors and royal ceremony. But the warmth of her childhood would not last. When Mary was just a teenager, her father's desire for a male heir turned against her. Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine, and with it declared Mary illegitimate. Her mother was banished. Her household dissolved. She was denied the title of princess, reduced to Lady Mary, and forced to swear allegiance to the new Queen, Anne Boleyn. She refused. For years, Mary endured humiliation in silence. She was watched, sometimes threatened. Her health faltered. But through it all, she clung tightly to her Catholic faith, the one constant in a world that seemed to unravel around her. The Bible, in Latin. The Mass, the soft hush of candlelight in cold stone churches, it became her anchor. When her father died, and her Protestant half-brother Edward ascended, Mary's position grew more precarious. Edward VI and his advisors were zealous reformers, reshaping England into a Protestant realm. Mary was watched even more closely. Yet again she refused to bend, and then in 1553, everything shifted. Edward died at 15. Protestant factions tried to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, a cousin malleable and Protestant, but Mary would not be bypassed. Supported by nobles and commoners alike, she rode to London with dignity and defiance. Her claim was not just legal, it was symbolic. A woman asserting her right, a Catholic reclaiming the crown. She was crowned Queen of England at 37 years old. For a brief moment, it seemed a golden restoration. Crowds cheered, bells rang. The old Catholic rites returned to Westminster. But beneath the pageantry, Mary's heart carried decades of betrayal, loss, and exile. She would not merely reign, she would redeem. Her mission was clear: restore the true faith to England. At first, the changes were cautious. Protestant clergy were dismissed. Latin Mass was reintroduced. Papal authority, long rejected by Henry, was quietly acknowledged again. But these moves were not enough for Mary. She wanted more than change. She wanted purification. In 1555, the Marian persecutions began. Heretics, she declared, must be shown mercy through fire. The first to burn was John Rogers, a preacher and Bible translator. Then came bishops, scholars, farmers, women, elderly and young, nearly 300 souls in all. In public squares across England, stakes were raised. Wood piled high, flames licked the skies, and Mary watched from afar, convinced she was saving their souls by sacrificing their bodies. It is easy to recoil from these acts, and we should. But to understand Mary is not to excuse her. It is to see how pain becomes doctrine. She believed she was repairing England's soul, that by fire she could bring about forgiveness, that the tears of her own life, a lost childhood, a mother scorned, a throne nearly stolen, could be avenged by the righteousness of a Catholic kingdom. Her faith was not just personal, it was absolute, and absolute faith leaves no room for gentleness. She married Philip II of Spain, son of the powerful Charles V, a deeply unpopular union. English hearts bristled at the thought of Spanish control, but Mary, longing for love and lineage, insisted. Her people grumbled, and when rebellion stirred, they were crushed. Quietly, efficiently, but there was no child. Despite signs of pregnancy, swelling, and the preparation of royal nurseries, the child never came. Modern scholars believe it was likely a false pregnancy, a tragic condition shaped by desperation and deep hope. When it happened again 2 years later, the result was the same. The Queen aged, her face hollowed, her hands shook in prayer more than command. Her husband left for Spain. Parliament resisted her more boldly. The country, scorched by executions and economic hardship, turned restless, and then, to complete the spiral, Calais, England's last possession in France, was lost in 15. She is said to have murmured that when she died, the name Calais would be found written on her heart. That same year, she grew gravely ill, worn down by sorrow and failure. Mary passed away at the age of 42. There was no child to succeed her. No Catholic dynasty. The crown passed to her half-sister, Elizabeth, who would rule for nearly 50 years and reverse every religious policy Mary had enforced. And so, history named her Bloody Mary, the Queen of Fire, the woman who burned her people for belief. But that is only one layer of her shadow. She was also the first woman to rule England alone, a pioneer in a world still uncertain of a queen's power. She survived political exile, religious oppression, and palace intrigue. She took the crown not as a wife or consort, but in her own right, in her own name. And she ruled as she lived, with devotion, certainty, and a grief so deep it became her compass. If we walk through St. James's Palace today, where her funeral passed in silence, we find no great monument to her memory, no towering statue, no glowing eulogy, only the soft echo of footsteps in a stone corridor. Perhaps that is fitting. Mary Tudor ruled with fire and was consumed by it. Tonight, as we fold her story away, let us do so gently. Let her name drift not as judgment, but as a quiet question. What becomes of a heart that never truly heals? Sleep now, and let the flames fade to ember. The Queen, at last, has found silence. The halls of the Louvre were not always bright with paintings and quiet admiration. In the 16th century, they echoed with whispers, political secrets drifting between columns, masked dancers beneath chandeliers, and the faint clink of poisoned glass. At the center of this world stood a woman whose legacy would be stitched with both silk and suspicion. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, and to many, the Black Widow of its darkest days. She was born not in France, but in Florence, in 1519, to one of the most powerful banking families in Europe. The Medici were wealthy, influential, and feared. But Catherine herself began life as an orphan, her parents both gone before she was 1. Her early years were spent in the shadow of convent walls, a noble child raised in silence and prayer. At 14, she was sent to France to marry Henry, the son of King Francis I. It was a match of politics, not affection. Catherine arrived at the glittering court a stranger, watched closely by nobles who whispered about her foreign blood. her modest dowry, her lack of rank. She was not expected to be great. She was expected to be quiet, but quiet does not mean blind. She observed everything, the flirtations, the alliances, the shifts in power. She watched her husband fall in love with another woman, Diane de Poitiers, who became his lifelong mistress. Catherine, meanwhile, was left childless for a decade. A dangerous position for a queen, yet she endured, patient, strategic, never demanding. And when at last children came, they came in abundance, 10 in total. Among them, 3 future kings. Her power began to stir. When Henry II died in a jousting accident, a splintered lance through the eye, Catherine's life changed forever. Her eldest son, Francis II, took the throne at just 15. But he was frail, and his queen mother became the quiet force behind his rule. When he died shortly after, she remained, this time as regent to her next son, Charles d'Ant, and later again to her third, Henry III. 3 kings, 1 mother, 1 guiding hand. France, in these years, was bleeding. The kingdom was torn between Catholics and Protestants, the wars of religion dividing towns, families and thrones. Catherine, a Catholic by tradition, saw more clearly than most the danger of extremism. She tried to walk a narrow line, arranging marriages, offering toleration, forging fragile peace. But peace in France then was a flickering candle, and it would be Catherine who oversaw its most terrifying extinguishment, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It began in August 1572. The Protestant leader, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, had come to Paris for the wedding of Catherine's daughter Margaret to the Protestant Prince Henry of Navarre. It was meant to seal peace between the warring faiths, a gesture of unity. Instead, it became the spark of horror. Catherine, increasingly anxious about Coligny's influence over her son, may have authorized, or at least accepted, a plan to eliminate him. But after his assassination attempt failed, tensions erupted. On the night of August 24, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois tolled, and Paris descended into chaos. Catholics turned on Protestants. Homes were invaded, streets ran with blood. The Seine, it was said, flowed red for days. Thousands were slaughtered, not just in Paris, but across France as news and fury spread. Historians still debate the numbers, but some estimate as many as 10,000 deaths. Catherine was blamed, painted in black, both literally and symbolically. She became the face of royal cruelty, a scheming mother who orchestrated murder in the name of control. She denied it. She wept publicly. But the stain never lifted. Still, she ruled. Her son Charles died young, broken in body and spirit. Her final son, Henry III, fared little better, his reign dogged by rebellion and court scandal. Catherine counseled him until her death in 1589, offering steady, if often cold advice. Her last years were spent writing letters, arranging marriages, and trying always to keep France from devouring itself. And yet, for all her political maneuvering, Catherine de' Medici was more than a figure of death. She loved the arts. She brought Italian cuisine to France. She funded astronomers, painters, architects. She built palaces and hosted pageants. The ballet, as we know it today, owes its evolution in part to her court. She was a patroness of beauty, a woman who, for all her iron, never stopped surrounding herself with silk. But history tends to favor simplicity over contradiction. And so Catherine became a villain, a witch in popular imagination. Tales of poison rings and dark rituals followed her. She was accused of using astrologers to predict deaths, of employing poisoners to remove rivals. Her name, centuries later, still conjures the scent of fear. Was it fair? She ruled in a time when women were barely tolerated in politics. She raised kings in a nation at war with itself. Her decisions were sharp, yes, but made in a world where softness meant collapse. And yet, she remains difficult to defend. Because while she did not start the fires of war, she did not always put them out. She let suspicion grow like ivy along palace walls. She let fear guide her hand. And in the end, Even her own children could not hold the crown she worked so desperately to protect. As we drift away from her story tonight, we leave not with answers, but with complexity. Catherine de' Medici was a queen who endured everything but peace, a mother who lost more than she won, a woman who ruled too long in a world that never wanted her there to begin with. So let the candles dim in her royal chambers, let the black silk fall still, and let the silence speak. At last, for the woman who once spoke too often through others, sleep, now, in the hush of old France, in the golden light of a Madrid morning, when the streets are quiet and the breeze carries the scent of dry stone and oranges. One might forget the stormy chapters written within Spain's royal walls, but deep within the folds of the 19th century lies the tale of a queen whose crown arrived too early, and whose legacy would be shaped not by strength, but by scandal, exile, and the heavy burden of expectation. Her name was Isabella II, born to rule, but never truly ready. She came into the world in 1830, the eldest daughter of King Ferdinand VII. A Spain still shaking from war and revolution greeted her arrival with mixed emotions. Her father, desperate for an heir to block the claim of his reactionary brother Don Carlos, changed the succession laws just for her. Thus, from her very first breath, Isabella was not simply a child. She was a political answer. And political answers rarely enjoy peaceful lives. When Ferdinand died in 1833, Isabella was just 3 years old. Her mother, Maria Cristina, became regent, but the Carlists, followers of Don Carlos, rejected her claim. Civil war followed. The First Carlist War, brutal and bitter, tore through the countryside. Spain, divided between those who clung to conservative tradition and those who longed for modern liberalism, became a fractured kingdom with a child at its center. Through it all, Isabella grew up in the gilded but tense chambers of the royal palace. Her education was fragmented. She was surrounded by courtiers more interested in power than pedagogy. Priests, generals, noble women, all took turns shaping her mind, often with conflicting ideas. She was lively, curious, but sheltered. The throne waited, and so did its pressures. At 13, she was declared of age and crowned queen. Barely a teenager, Isabella stood before her people wearing robes that seemed to swallow her whole. The eyes of a nation rested on her, and quietly judged. Her reign began awkwardly. Isabella, still so young, was surrounded by older advisors, military men, conservative ministers, and schemers who saw her as a symbol to be molded. They fought for control of her court. Scandals emerged. Corruption festered, and the queen, rather than reigning, often drifted, emotionally impulsive, deeply devout, yet politically indecisive. Then came the marriage. To preserve dynastic stability, she was forced to marry her double first cousin, Francisco de Assis. It was, by all accounts, a disaster. Francisco was delicate, shy, and deeply mismatched with the passionate and impatient queen. Rumors swirled about his sexuality, her lovers, and the nature of their relationship. Whispered jokes called him Doña Paquita, a cruel jab at his perceived femininity. They shared a crown, but little else. Over the years, Isabella bore children, several of them. But few believed they were Francisco's. Instead, her name became entangled with a string of alleged lovers, military officers, noblemen, even musicians. Court gossip frothed daily. Her personal life became a public spectacle, and her political life suffered as a result. Yet, she remained queen. Through revolts, uprisings, and the chaos of Spain's shifting governments, Isabella clung to the throne. She leaned heavily on the army to keep order, granting favors and promotions to those who kept her reign intact. But this reliance on generals and her frequent political favoritism only deepened divisions. Liberal hopes faded, conservatives grew restless. By the 1860s, Spain was weary of monarchy, or at least this monarchy. In 1868, the powder keg exploded. The Glorious Revolution, La Gloriosa, was swift and decisive. Troops turned against her. Crowds rose. Even former allies abandoned her cause. Isabella fled to France, exiled in the quiet outskirts of Paris. where the fountains ran cold and the wine no longer flowed in royal halls. She lived there in retreat, still calling herself queen, though few listened. Her son, Alfonso XII, would eventually be restored to the throne in 1874, after years of Republican regency, but Isabella never ruled again. She abdicated formally in 1870, worn down by years of exile and the ache of watching Spain move on without her. She died in 1904, a quiet figure in a foreign land, remembered more for her excesses than her victories, and yet in the gentle dusk of hindsight, Isabella's story reveals not just personal failure, but the weight of impossible inheritance. She was a child queen in a fractured kingdom, a young woman forced into a loveless marriage, a ruler trapped between fading absolutism and the rise of modern governance. She made poor choices, yes, but many were shaped long before she could understand them. Even her scandals, so gleefully documented by her enemies, reveal a kind of yearning for affection, for control, for a life not dictated by dynastic duty. Her love affairs may have been messy, but they were perhaps the only part of her reign she truly owned. History, for a time, painted her as frivolous, foolish, even vulgar. But tonight, we let that portrait soften, not as a defense, but as a deeper reflection. Isabella II did not break Spain, she simply could not mend what had already been splintered. As we let the night wrap gently around her story, imagine the echo of her footsteps down the tiled corridors of the royal palace of Madrid. A young girl, alone with too many responsibilities and too little love. Let the noise fall away now. Let her story grow quiet, for even queens once forgotten deserve rest. The Tang dynasty dawned with golden promise. Silk fluttered through palace halls, poets wandered beneath flowering trees, and the court of China flourished like a garden after spring rains. It was a time of elegance, of power, of order shaped by emperors, until one woman shattered centuries of tradition and placed herself alone upon the dragon throne. Her name was Wu Zetian, and she remains the only woman in over 2 millennia of Chinese imperial history to rule as emperor in her own right. She was not born into power. In 624, Wu Zhao, as she was first named, entered the world as the daughter of a wealthy but unexceptional family. Her father, a timber merchant elevated by military service, ensured she received an uncommon education for a girl: literature, music, history, calligraphy. While other daughters learned embroidery and modesty, young Wu memorized Confucius and read the classics aloud by lantern light. At 14, she was summoned to court as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, one among many. For years she lived in the shadows of other women, serving tea, attending rituals, and keeping her gaze lowered. It was not until the emperor's death that her life began to shift, and with it the course of a dynasty. Custom dictated that imperial concubines, upon the death of the emperor, be sent to Buddhist convents. Wu entered one quietly, shaved her head, and seemed resigned to obscurity. But she had no intention of disappearing. Within the monastery's incense-laced halls, she stayed informed. The new emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son, had known Wu at court, and perhaps more importantly, he remembered her. Within 2 years, she was recalled from the convent and returned not as a servant but as his favorite. A bold move, a dangerous one, but it marked the beginning of her climb. She did not rise through luck alone. Wu was sharp, observant, politically astute, and endlessly patient. She forged alliances through flattery and fear. Rivals were removed with chilling efficiency, some accused of treason, others found poisoned or exiled. Even Empress Wang, once secure in her place, was deposed and executed. By 65-5, Wu was crowned empress consort. In the years that followed, she all but ruled in her husband's name. As Gaozong's health declined, Wu stepped further into the light, issuing edicts, receiving envoys, presiding over court with calm command. Ministers who challenged her found themselves disgraced or gone. Others bent willingly, recognizing the strength she wielded behind the silken curtains of the inner court. When Gaozong died in 603, Their son Zhongzong inherited the throne, but he quickly fell under the influence of his wife's family, a challenge Wu would not tolerate. Within weeks she deposed him and placed another son, Ru Sung, in his place. He too was a figurehead. Behind the throne, Empress Wu tightened her grip. Then, in 690, she stepped through the final door. No longer content to rule as regent, she proclaimed herself emperor of a new dynasty, the Zhou, a woman, sitting where only sons had sat. A mother, now a monarch in name and law. China, vast, ancient, patriarchal, bowed to a woman's seal. And she ruled not as a symbol but as a sovereign. Her court became a fusion of order and surveillance. She expanded the civil service exam system, encouraging the rise of talented scholars over hereditary nobles. She promoted Buddhism over Confucianism, framing her reign as divinely blessed by prophecy, the Bodhisattva reborn in female form. Monasteries multiplied. Temples rose in her honor. She also made use of a secret police, charged with rooting out dissent. Whispers could cost lives. Families vanished overnight. The court grew both efficient and afraid. And yet, the empire prospered. Infrastructure improved. Taxes stabilized. Trade with distant lands flourished. The arts blossomed under her patronage. Even her harshest critics would later admit, Wu brought stability where others had failed. Still, her reign was never truly secure. Court historians, trained to view women as subordinate, recorded her story with suspicion. They called her ruthless, vain, manipulative. They whispered of lovers half her age, of towers filled with torture, of babies killed to clear her path. Some of these tales may hold truth. Others are likely inventions, cautionary myths, woven by those who feared what she represented, a woman who proved she could rule as well, or better, than any man. In 705, at the age of 80, Wu's health failed. Her ministers, growing restless, weary of her favorites and fearful of legacy, pressured her to abdicate. She yielded, quietly, and died not long after. The Tang dynasty resumed. Her name was struck from official records, her dynasty erased, even her tomb, the Grand Qianling Mausoleum, bears no inscription. Only 2 stone tablets left blank, as though history could not decide what to call her. But her silence speaks louder than any verdict. Wu Zetian, Empress Regnant, reshaped not just the throne, but the very idea of who might sit upon it. Her legacy is still debated in China today. Some hail her as a pioneer, a leader who defied gender and rose through merit and force. Others see her as an ambitious usurper, cloaked in piety but driven by calculation. Perhaps she was both. Tonight, as the moon rises over the old imperial city of Luoyang, her story lingers, not in condemnation, but in curiosity. Who was she, truly? A ruthless widow, a wise sovereign, a lonely woman surrounded by men too frightened to follow her. The answer may be as layered as the silk robes she once wore, soft on the outside, woven with strength beneath. Let her rest now, in the valley of emperors. Let her throne remain empty, but not forgotten. Let the silence above her tomb speak not of erasure, but of awe. Sleep softly, beneath the shadow of the dragon. On the island of Madagascar, where mist drapes over forested highlands and the air carries the scent of cloves and wood smoke, there once ruled a queen whose name became a hush across oceans. She stood alone on her throne, untouched by Europe's maps and ambitions, defending her kingdom with fire and fear. Her name was Ranavalona the Firth, and to many outside her realm she was a mystery wrapped in menace. But within Madagascar, her story was more than cruelty. It was survival, and in her silence, there echoed the cry of a people who refused to disappear. She was born in 1778, to a noble family, aligned with the ruling Marina kingdom. Her father, brave and loyal, once uncovered a plot against the king. In gratitude, the monarch adopted the young girl into the royal household. Raised among princes and adizes, she learned early the cost of power and the cunning required to keep it. When the king's son, Radama I ascended the throne. Ranavalona was given to him as one of several wives. But she was unlike the others. She observed quietly, listened closely, and never forgot the winding corridors of the palace, where decisions whispered in one ear could shape the fate of villages far beyond. Radama, the king, embraced European alliances. He welcomed missionaries, allowed Christian conversions, and signed trade treaties with Britain and France. He hoped to modernize, to turn Madagascar into a new kind of kingdom. But not all at court shared his vision, and among those watching with the sharpest eyes was Ranavalona. When Radama died in 1828, no clear heir stood ready. By traditional law, none of the king's wives could rule, but tradition often bends to will. Ranavalona moved swiftly. With the support of military officers and palace factions wary of foreign influence, she declared herself sovereign. Rivals were eliminated, opponents vanished, and at the age of 50, she was crowned Queen of Madagascar. Her rule would stretch for more than 3 decades, and it would leave the world divided in judgment. Ranavalona believed in one thing above all: independence. To preserve it, she would sever ties, silence missionaries, and purge foreign entanglements. She saw Christianity not as salvation, but as colonial entry. European treaties, in her eyes, were veils for conquest. So, piece by piece, she unwound her predecessors' alliances. She expelled missionaries, outlawed the practice of Christianity. Foreign books were burned, converts were arrested, trials were held by Tangina, an ancient Malagasy ritual involving poison and ordeal, often fatal. Punishment was severe, public, and to her mind, necessary. To many in the West, these actions earned her the label of tyrant. Tales spread of torture, executions, and forced labor. Travelers and diplomats painted her as bloodthirsty and cruel. The Queen of Madagascar became a ghost story in Victorian drawing rooms, a woman beyond reason, an island draped in smoke and iron. But within her kingdom, the view was more complex. Ranavalona saw herself not as a villain but as a guardian. She strengthened the military, revived sacred customs, and enforced laws without exception. She reinstated ancestral rituals, demanded loyalty from nobles, and refused to bow before the rising tide of European empire. Where other African rulers made uneasy peace with colonizers, she built walls, not of stone, but of will, and she did not rule alone. By her side stood Rainy Haro, a former soldier, later her prime minister and companion. Together they forged a government built on discipline and tradition. Foreigners were allowed only under strict control. Trade continued, but at Madagascar's terms. Intrusion was not tolerated. Her methods, undeniably harsh, created order. Roads were maintained, infrastructure improved. The capital, Antananarivo, grew in structure and ceremony. Her palace became the center of a world few outsiders could fully understand. But isolation has its cost. As the years passed, pressure mounted. European powers circled Madagascar like vultures, waiting. Arms shipments became harder to secure. Internal rebellions sparked and were crushed. Christianity continued to spread underground. Hidden behind closed doors, the Queen's grip, though firm, could not stop time. By the 1850s, her health declined, and with it, so too did her vision of an untouchable Madagascar. Still, she refused to surrender. She ruled until 1861, dying at the age of 83. Her body, wrapped in royal silks, was placed in the sacred tombs of the Marina. Her name, whispered with awe or dread, became legend. The years that followed would see Madagascar open once again, slowly, cautiously, under her successors. Eventually, in 1896, it would fall to French colonial rule, the very outcome she had spent a lifetime resisting, and yet she had delayed it longer than any believed possible. Ranavalona remains one of history's most divisive figures. To some, she was a despot, cold and unrelenting, a ruler who spilled blood to avoid progress. To others, she was a shield, standing alone between her people and the grinding machinery of empire. Perhaps she was both. She ruled at a time when Africa was being carved by European ambition, when kings and queens across the continent were being replaced by governors, generals, and foreign flags. She chose resistance, and though her throne was made of fear, it was also built on a fierce refusal to surrender identity. Tonight, let her story settle like the fog over Madagascar's forests, a queen in red earth and sacred chants. A woman who watched ships arrive and said, "No farther, let the judgment rest with time." Let her spirit drift beyond palace gates, where wild lemurs call through trees that still remember her name. Let the wind carry it, soft and slow. Ranavalona. Lisbon's morning air is often damp with salt, not from rain but from the nearness of the sea, where Atlantic winds whisper against painted walls and tiled courtyards. And within those palaces of light and marble, there once reigned a queen, whose story drifted slowly toward darkness. Her name was Maria the first queen regnant of Portugal. She ruled not with iron, but with sorrow, and over time became known as Maria the Mad. Yet beneath that name lies not cruelty, nor tyranny, but grief, whispered through velvet halls. Maria Francesca Isabel was born in 1734, the daughter of King José I and Queen Mariana Victoria. She grew up within the opulence of the Portuguese court during a time of reconstruction. After the devastating Lisbon earthquake of 1755, the capital had been rebuilt, cleaner, more modern, more controlled, but the shadows of that disaster never fully faded. They lingered behind architecture and policy, and they echoed in the crown. Maria would one day inherit. Her early life was guided by strict piety. Raised deeply Catholic, she was devout from a young age, preferring prayer over parties, solemnity over spectacle. Her father's powerful minister, the Marquis of Pombal, shaped much of Portugal's modern governance, but Maria distrusted his secularism and harsh rule. When she ascended the throne in 1777, following her father's death, she made her first bold move. She dismissed Pombal. It was a sign that her reign would be led by conscience. She became the first woman to rule Portugal in her own name, styled not as a regent or consort, but as Rainha, Queen. She ruled jointly with her husband Pedro III, who also happened to be her uncle. Though unusual by modern standards, such marriages were common in European dynasties, seen as a way to preserve royal bloodlines. Their partnership was peaceful, if not passionate. Pedro was content to let Maria lead, and in the early years of her reign the queen proved diligent and capable. She was deeply committed to faith and morality. Her court was modest, governed by Catholic ethics. She invested in education, social welfare, and religious institutions. She issued laws against corruption and sought to rule justly. Diplomats from other courts often praised her intelligence and grace, but the sky around her mind was beginning to darken. The first shadows fell in the 1780s. Her beloved husband Pedro died in 1786. The loss shook her deeply. Grief became a quiet companion, clinging to her even during royal ceremonies. Then, in swift succession, her eldest son died. Her confessor, a spiritual anchor, also passed. The twin blows fractured something within her. By the late 1780s, Maria's behavior began to change. Reports describe her as weeping uncontrollably, speaking to the dead, suffering from hallucinations. She wandered palace halls in mourning garments. The court began to whisper. Ministers grew nervous. By 1792, her son João, the future King João VI, quietly assumed power as regent. The queen was declared mentally unfit to rule. Still, she lived on, present but unreachable, her body draped in silk while her mind drifted elsewhere. And then came revolution. Across the sea in France, the monarchy fell. The guillotine rose. Portugal, allied with Britain, watched with growing fear as Napoleon's armies marched through Europe. By the early 1800s, Portugal was under immense pressure to sever ties with Britain. When it refused, France invaded. In 1807, the royal family made a desperate decision: exile. Maria, now aged and lost in her mind, was carried aboard a British ship, bound not for another European court, but for Brazil. Thus began one of the most extraordinary episodes in colonial history, the entire Portuguese court relocating to Rio de Janeiro. For Brazil, it marked the beginning of royal presence and later independence. For Maria, it was the fading of her final light. She lived in a palace overlooking the sea, her mind wrapped in prayer and phantoms, far from the country she once ruled. She died in 1816, in exile, in silence. History would name her Maria the Mad. But tonight, we pause to reflect on what that truly means. She was not a despot. She waged no wars, she did not burn cities or command cruelty. Her reign began with fairness, principle, and faith. And her decline was not of character, but of health. What if her mind had stayed intact? What if her son had not died? What if her sorrow had been met with more than whispered prayers behind locked doors? Even in her brokenness, Maria I changed history. She was the first monarch to rule a united Portugal and Brazil, even if only by title. Her court in Rio laid the groundwork for Brazil's royal institutions, and in her quiet suffering, she reminded the world that crowns do not shield the soul. The palaces she once walked are still standing, in Lisbon, in Rio. Their walls have forgotten her voice, but sometimes, in the quiet of a painted corridor, you can still feel the melancholy, soft as ash, quiet as fog. So tonight, let us remember Maria not as mad, but as human. Let her rest beneath Portugal's stars, where bells toll no longer for empire, but for understanding. Sleep now, dear Queen. Your sorrow is no longer yours to bear. Before Spain was Spain, before its crowns were unified and its galleons filled with gold, there lived a queen whose reign was wrapped in shadow, not by misrule but by emotion. Her name was Joanna of Castile, though history would come to call her Joana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But madness, in her story, may not have been illness at all. Perhaps it was grief, perhaps betrayal, or perhaps it was love, held far too tightly. She was born in 1479, the third child of two of Europe's most powerful monarchs, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. From the very beginning, Joanna was royal, but not destined for rule. Her elder sibling stood before her in the line of succession. She was meant to be a diplomatic link, a bridge between kingdoms. And so, at 16, she was married to Philip the Handsome, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a union between Castile and Burgundy, politics cloaked in velvet and ceremony. But what began as alliance soon bloomed into obsession. Philip was striking, tall, fair, and charismatic. Joanna, intelligent and passionate, fell for him swiftly and completely. Their early marriage was filled with closeness, but also jealousy. She clung to him. He, often distracted by other women, found her devotion suffocating. Still, they had children, 6 in total, including Charles, who would later become Emperor Charles V. Their dynastic success was undeniable. But Joanna's world began to change when her older siblings died in succession. Suddenly, she was heir to Castile, the most powerful kingdom in Iberia. When her mother, Isabella the Catholic, died in 1504, Joanna became Queen of Castile, and her troubles truly began. Philip, ambitious and confident, now saw himself as king in name and rule. But Isabella's will had placed power in Joanna's hands. Ferdinand, her father, was determined to maintain influence as regent. The result was a bitter struggle, not just for territory, but for control over a queen whose mind began to fray beneath the weight of it all. At court, they whispered that Joanna was unstable, that she wept for hours, that she raged with jealousy, that she could not govern. And perhaps some of it was true. She had long suffered from intense emotional swings. She became deeply religious, withdrawn, fixated on loyalty. She mistrusted those around her. She saw betrayal in even the softest words. But she was also politically astute, capable of making decisions, understanding court alliances, and asserting her rights. The problem was not her inability to rule, but that those closest to her feared what might happen if she did. When Philip suddenly died in 1506, reportedly of typhoid, though some suspected poison, Joanna's grief broke something in her. She refused to bury him. She had his body embalmed and kept near her at all times. At night, she reportedly opened his coffin just to be near him. She traveled with his remains across Castile, sleeping beside the casket in remote monasteries. She wore black, spoke to no one, and called herself his faithful wife. Still, to many, it was the final proof of her madness. Her father, Ferdinand, returned and quickly seized power, locking Joanna away in the fortress of Tordesillas. There, surrounded by stone and silence, she lived for decades. She was still queen in name, even as her father ruled, and later, her son Charles. They visited her rarely. They kept her hidden. For over 40 years, Joanna remained imprisoned in her own kingdom. She was not treated cruelly, but neither was she free. She lived with a few attendants, sometimes refusing food, sometimes falling into long silences. At other times she was lucid, speaking with clarity about the affairs of the world outside. She read, she prayed, she waited. The world changed around her. The Spanish Empire grew. America was claimed and carved. The Habsburg dynasty spread across Europe. And still, Joanna remained in her shadowed chamber, a monarch in name only. She died in 5055, at the age of 75, having spent nearly 2/3 of her life in captivity. So why was she called mad? The question lingers like candle smoke. Was she mentally ill, suffering from what we now recognize as clinical depression or bipolar disorder? Or was she a woman used, silenced, and broken by the men around her, each of whom had something to gain from keeping her quiet? Perhaps it was both. What is certain is that Joanna was never violent, never cruel, never unfit to love, perhaps only unfit to survive a world that demanded rulers wear masks, not hearts. She was a queen who loved too deeply, a wife who could not forget, a daughter and mother erased by the ambitions of those who claimed to protect her. Tonight, as the wind stirs through the olive trees outside Tordesillas, you might imagine her still there, walking softly through the garden paths, whispering her husband's name beneath her breath. Not mad, not weak, but unbearably human. Let her story end, not in shame, but in sympathy. Let her crown be remembered, not for the power it failed to bring her, but for the weight it asked her to bear. Let her rest now, in peace she never found in life. In the far north, where winter sunlight lingers like a whisper on icy streets and snow dusts palace roofs like forgotten lace, there lived a queen whose reign defied expectation. She ruled not with brutality, but with contradiction. Learned yet impulsive, regal yet rebellious. Her name was Christina, of Sweden, and she became one of Europe's most unusual monarchs, not for how she governed, but for how she walked away. Born in 1626, Christina was never meant to rule. Her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, had longed for a male heir, but when his only son died at birth, and Christina arrived healthy and strong, he declared her his successor. She was raised not as a princess, but as a prince. Educated like a king, trained in languages, sciences, and statecraft. It was said she studied 12 hours a day, absorbing philosophy before most children could write. Her father was Sweden's great Protestant hero, a commander who led armies across Europe during the 30 Years' War, but he died in battle when Christina was just 6 years old. From that moment the crown hovered above her head. At 18, she assumed full power. The court expected a dutiful queen, one who would marry, bear heirs, and maintain Sweden's Lutheran strength. But Christina had her own ideas. She was brilliant, sharp-tongued, and unpredictable. She surrounded herself with scholars and artists, turning Stockholm into a northern haven of intellectual life. René Descartes, the French philosopher, died of pneumonia in her freezing court, having been summoned to teach her philosophy. She read voraciously. She hosted debates. She wrote letters to kings and popes alike, and she refused to marry. This refusal baffled her advisors. Marriage was a requirement. They argued, a matter of stability, dynasty, duty. But Christina resisted with growing intensity. She declared she had no interest in being a wife, nor in raising children. Whispers filled the palace halls, that she dressed in men's clothing, that she walked like a soldier, that she preferred the company of women. Her close relationship with a noblewoman, Ebba Spar, stirred rumors long after they both passed from power, but Christina was unmoved by gossip. She remained resolute. She would not marry, she would not produce an heir. She would not live a life others chose for her. Her rule, while progressive in culture, was uneven in politics. She spent lavishly, depleting the royal treasury. She angered nobles with sudden dismissals. Religious tensions rose when she showed tolerance to Catholics and Jews, breaking with strict Lutheran policy. The pressure mounted. Then, in a stunning move, she summoned her council in 1654 and announced she would abdicate. They thought it a jest. Queens do not walk away. But Christina was firm. She had chosen a successor, her cousin Charles X. She would not stay. In a solemn ceremony she removed her crown, her scepter, and the royal robe. Dressed in a simple white gown, she stepped away from the throne and into legend. Her reasons were layered. She longed for freedom, from expectation, from religion, from identity. Above all, she sought spiritual and intellectual liberty. A year later she converted secretly to Catholicism, a move that would have been scandalous, even dangerous, had she done it while on the throne. In Rome, she arrived not as exile, but as spectacle. In Rome, she arrived not as exile, but as spectacle. The papal court received her with awe and uncertainty. A former Protestant queen, now Catholic, brilliant, eccentric, and unpredictable, she fascinated Europe. Her entrance into the Vatican was grand. Her conversion was public. Yet her life in Rome was anything but quiet. She established a court of her own, filled with musicians, artists, and thinkers. She wrote essays. She patronized the arts. She corresponded with philosophers. She tried at times to regain political power, offering herself as a ruler to Naples and Poland, but was rejected each time. Her temper, pride, and extravagance unsettled even her allies. And yet, she remained unforgettable. Rome never quite knew what to make of her. She was deeply Catholic, yet dismissed much of church orthodoxy. She praised chastity, but lived as she pleased. She championed the arts but resisted domestic tradition. In every way she was contradiction made flesh. She died in 1689 at the age of 62, never having returned to Sweden. She was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, one of only 3 women ever granted such an honor. Her sarcophagus rests beneath marble and candlelight, inscribed with the name of a queen who chose her own story. So what makes Christina one of the worst queens? Some point to her spending, her refusal to marry, her disregard for custom. She left Sweden without a clear heir. She abandoned the Lutheran faith. Her politics were inconsistent. Her vision alienated those around her. But to others, she is remembered not for failure, but for freedom. She rejected the throne not out of weakness but out of strength. She sought a life unchained from birthright. She stepped down not in disgrace but in defiance, choosing identity over duty, thought over tradition. And perhaps that's what truly frightened her contemporaries. She was a queen who refused to be anyone's ideal, not a wife, not a mother, not a Protestant icon, not a figurehead. She carved out her place between empires, brilliant, flawed, unapologetic. Tonight, let her story drift over the frozen lakes of Sweden, where once a child prince stood before her father's grave. Let it pass through the candlelit chambers of Rome, where her laughter once echoed beneath painted ceilings. Let her rest now, a queen by birth, a philosopher by choice. And if you ever feel the weight of expectations too heavy to carry, remember Christina, the monarch, who laid down her crown and walked toward herself. There are some names in history that seem scorched into memory, not whispered, but hissed. and few monarchs carry a legacy as bitter as Mary the Fat of England. To many she is remembered as Bloody Mary, the Queen whose reign burned with smoke and screams, but beneath the flames lies something quieter. A woman not born for cruelty, but shaped by exile, heartbreak, and the desperate hope to heal a broken world with fire. Mary was born in 1516, the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon. She was raised in opulence, promised the crown as a princess, but her world shattered when her father sought a son and tore England from the Catholic Church to get one. Her mother, devout and proud, was cast aside. Mary was declared illegitimate. She was forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, from princess to pawn, from beloved child to political inconvenience. Mary's early life was carved by rejection. Still, she held to her mother's faith. She watched as England transformed. Monasteries dissolved, priests arrested, Latin Mass replaced. And behind it all stood her father, the very man who had once cradled her in his arms. It left a wound that never truly closed. When Henry died in 1547, Mary's half-brother, Edward VI, a Protestant child king, took the throne. During his reign, Mary was again pushed aside. She clung to the old religion, celebrating Mass in secret. She became a symbol of resistance to the Protestant regime. Edward and his advisors grew wary, then hostile. There were attempts to silence her, even whispers of removing her by force. But fate did not favor them. Edward died young in 1553. His council, desperate to preserve Protestantism, attempted to install Lady Jane Grey, a cousin, as queen. But the people rose, London filled with Mary's supporters. The army crumbled. Jane was deposed after 9 days. And so, Mary, at 37, ascended the throne. The first queen regnant in England's history. Her arrival was greeted with joy. Bells rang. Crowds cheered. A woman of noble faith, long persecuted, had claimed her rightful place. But Mary came not to reform, but to restore. Her mission was clear, to bring England back to the Catholic Church. Not through persuasion, not through education, but through absolute obedience. She repealed Protestant laws, restored papal authority, brought back the Latin Mass, and most infamously, began the Marian persecutions. Over 280 Protestants, bishops, ministers, and laypeople were burned at the stake. The fires lit across towns and cities were meant to cleanse England of heresy, to purify its soul, but instead they scarred it. Some died silently, others crying out prayers in English. As the flames consumed them, the burnings, widely reported and chronicled by Protestant writers like John Foxe, created martyrs. They did not extinguish belief, they deepened it. Mary believed herself righteous. She saw suffering as a path to salvation. Her confessor encouraged her to stay the course. Her advisors justified the executions, and her people slowly turned away in fear. Amid this, she made another fateful choice. She married. In 1554, Mary wed Philip II of Spain, son of the powerful Holy Roman Emperor. She saw the union as a way to strengthen England's Catholic future. But the people saw something else. A foreign king, a Spanish shadow over English soil. The marriage was cold. Philip barely spent time in England. Mary longed for love, and more urgently, for a child. Without an heir, her Protestant sister Elizabeth would succeed her. In 55 she believed she was pregnant. Her belly swelled, preparations were made, bells were cast. But the child never came. It was likely a false pregnancy, a condition born of desperate hope. She never conceived again. Her health declined. Her heart broke. Her husband returned to Spain. And all the while, England whispered of suffering. Crops failed. The treasury weakened. The fires continued. By 1558, Mary was a shadow, sick, sorrowful, and alone. She died at the age of 42, her body consumed by what many believed was uterine cancer. Her last words were said to be, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." Calais, the last English possession in France, had been lost during her reign, but perhaps she mourned more than a city. Perhaps she mourned faith and failure, and the dream of a world where her mother's church and her father's kingdom could be won again. History was not kind to her. Elizabeth succeeded her, ushering in a Protestant golden age. Under her sister's long rule, Mary became a symbol of backwardness, of cruelty, of foreign darkness. And yet, Mary had ruled with the same certainty her father had, just for a different God. So, was she among the worst queens? It depends where you place the candle. She did not wage reckless wars. She did not rule for personal pleasure. She was not indifferent. But her reign was one of absolutism, of fire and fear, where dissent was silenced by flame and mercy was offered only through obedience. She believed she was saving her people, but in doing so, she drove them further away. Tonight, let us remember Queen Mary not just by her worst but by her whole. A daughter abandoned, a believer unwavering, a queen crowned too late, in a world she no longer recognized. Let her story be a warning that devotion without wisdom can burn even the truest hearts. Let the fires be ashes now, and let her rest. Not as Bloody Mary, but as Mary, the woman who could not let go of what had already slipped away. Beneath the towering peaks of ancient Chang'an, where the wind once carried silk and secrets through the gates of the imperial palace, there lived a woman who defied the natural order, not by accident, but by will. She began her life as a concubine. She ended it as Empress Regnant of China, the only woman in history to officially rule in her own name. Her name was Wu Zetian. To some, she was a tyrant. To others, a visionary. And like all rulers who shattered tradition, her story flickers between triumph and terror, wisdom and ruthlessness, never still. She was born in 64 during the early years of the Tang dynasty, into a noble family known for scholarship. From childhood, she was unlike other girls, sharp in speech, confident in posture, endlessly curious. She read Confucian texts, wrote poetry, studied history. In a world where women were taught to serve, Wu learned how to think. At just 14, she entered the palace as a concubine to Emperor Taizong, a man of great power and greater silence. Her beauty was noted, but it was her mind that stood out. She watched the inner workings of the court, the quiet moves of ministers, the etiquette of survival. She did not rise immediately. She waited. And when the emperor died, she was sent as tradition demanded, to a convent, her hair cut, her voice quieted. But Wu was not done. She caught the eye of the new emperor, Gozong, Taizong's son, who had known her during his father's reign. Against custom and scandal, he summoned her back to court. She returned, not as concubine, but as something more, his confidant, his consort, and eventually, his wife. Their bond was complex. Gaozong ruled in name, but Wu Zetian became the power behind the curtain. When he suffered a stroke, she stepped forward, first to advise, then to command. In whispers, she was already empress. But her ascent was not smooth. She faced fierce opposition from scholars, nobles, and members of the royal family. She responded with strategic force. She accused rivals of treason. She orchestrated trials. Some died by decree. Others simply disappeared. The palace feared her, but could not deny her strength. She was intelligent, administrative, charismatic. She rewarded loyalty. She built networks, and slowly her enemies grew fewer. When Emperor Gaozong died in 6083, Wu Zetian placed her sons on the throne, one after another, but neither ruled for long. She found them weak, easily swayed. She wanted more than influence. She wanted the mandate of heaven, and in 690 she claimed it. She deposed her own son and declared herself Emperor of China, not as regent or queen mother, but as sovereign in full. She founded her own dynasty, the Zhou briefly interrupting the Tang line. The celestial order had shifted. A woman now sat on the dragon throne. It was an act that shook the empire. Confucian tradition placed women beneath men in all things. A female ruler was seen as unnatural, even dangerous. But Wu answered not with apology, but with policy. She governed with efficiency and vision. She promoted meritocracy, expanding the imperial examination system to recruit talent. She elevated scholars of humble origin. She reduced the influence of powerful families. Infrastructure grew. The treasury swelled. Buddhism flourished under her favor. She also controlled information. She sponsored texts that supported her reign. Propaganda, in its earliest form, was deployed to recast her rise as destined, even foretold by prophecy. But power does not soften all edges. She maintained an extensive secret police. Suspected dissenters were executed or exiled. Surveillance stretched from market stalls to ministerial chambers. Her court, while vibrant with poets and reformers, also lived in quiet fear. And yet, she was adored by many of her subjects, especially those outside the elite. She taxed fairly, improved grain distribution, and protected the peasantry. For many, her rule brought stability and possibility. Still, her gender remained a scandal in the eyes of traditionalists. To them, her strength was proof of corruption. Her vision, a mask for ambition. She reigned for 15 years as emperor. Then, nearing 80, her grip began to falter. Illness crept in. Factions grew bold. In 705, she was pressured to abdicate. The Tang dynasty was restored. She died soon after, aged 81, the longest-lived emperor of her time. Her tomb rests at the base of Mount Lang, flanked by stone guardians. And on her great stele, a monument carved for emperors. The inscription is left blank, not in error, but by design. Some say it was humility, others, a final defiance, daring history to decide what she had been. Was she among the worst queens? That depends on where one stands. To her enemies, she was ruthless, willing to crush dissent, poison rivals, manipulate the very bloodline of empire. To her admirers, she was a revolutionary, lifting the capable, challenging hierarchy, bringing order to chaos. She was both. She was the storm and the shelter, the sword and the scholar, a woman who refused to be less than sovereign, even when the world told her it was unnatural. And tonight, as the wind rises beyond the walls of her empty stele, we remember her not in fear, but in awe. Let her legacy remain blank, not for shame, but because no single story could ever contain her. Let her be remembered, not as Empress Wu the usurper, but as Wu Zetian, the woman who rewrote the stars. There are places in the world where time moves differently, where ancient customs and foreign ships once brushed against each other like driftwood in a great sea. Madagascar, the vast island off Africa's southeastern coast, was one such place, lush, remote, sovereign, and within its highland palaces and stone-walled temples one queen ruled with such absolute control that she sealed her kingdom off from the world for decades. Her name was Ranavalona, Einen, and her reign was one of contradiction, of cultural pride, spiritual fervor, and ruthless preservation. She was not born for the crown. In fact, her early life was marked by obscurity. But fate favored her family. In the early 19th century, King Endrianamporni Marina, the unifier of the Marina people, honored Ranavalona's father after he uncovered a plot against the king's life. As reward, the young girl was adopted into the royal household. She married Prince Radama, the heir to the throne. And when he became King Radama I, she entered a court on the cusp of modern transformation. Radama embraced European alliances, allowing British missionaries to enter the kingdom, bringing Christianity, Western medicine, and education. He opened trade routes. His court wore imported uniforms. Foreign maps began to include Madagascar more prominently. But Radama died young, and without a clear heir. A power vacuum emerged. Ranavalona moved swiftly. Backed by conservative nobles and military leaders, wary of foreign influence, she seized the throne in 1828. It was an unusual, even revolutionary act for a woman. But she did not hesitate. She declared herself sovereign queen of Madagascar, and immediately set about undoing much of what her late husband had started. To the Europeans, it was a shocking reversal. To her own people, it was something more, the fierce return of ancestral rule. She expelled Christian missionaries, banned foreign religions, and declared traditional Malagasy beliefs to be the state's only sanctioned spirituality. Churches were destroyed, converts were pressured, and later persecuted. A new policy of isolation took hold. She reinstated trial by ordeal, including the use of tanginar, a ritual poison to determine innocence. Those accused of crimes were forced to ingest it, along with free chicken skins. If they vomited them up, they were declared innocent. If not, they were guilty or dead. Thousands perished under this system. European observers, especially missionaries, who had converted many locals, branded her as a despot. They wrote letters home describing mass executions, religious martyrdoms, and a queen drunk with cruelty. But within Madagascar, the picture was more complex. Reina Valona viewed herself not as a tyrant, but as a defender. Foreigners, she believed, threatened Malagasy sovereignty, culture, and spiritual purity. The missionaries brought not just Bibles but influence, reshaping customs, language, and loyalties. She saw colonization not as a distant risk, but an active threat. And she was not wrong. Across Africa and Asia, European empires were expanding. Her neighbors were falling. Madagascar, for a time, stood alone. Not because of diplomacy, but because of fear and force. She crushed rebellions, she raised armies, she refused trade agreements that gave advantage to foreign powers. She maintained a carefully balanced court of nobles and advisors, punishing disloyalty without hesitation. And yet, despite her fearsome reputation, she ruled for 33 years. Her court was orderly. Infrastructure expanded, roads were built. The capital city of Antananarivo grew. Local industries thrived, including ironwork and weaving. Foreigners, those few allowed to remain, were strictly monitored, but often impressed by the scale of her governance. Still, the persecution of Christians continued. From 1835 onward, open Christian worship was banned. Secret gatherings met in forests, basements, and caves. Those caught were publicly executed, some thrown from cliffs, others burned or beheaded. It is estimated that several thousand died for their faith during her reign. And yet the religion did not die. It went underground, growing silently, like roots beneath stone. The more she tried to destroy it, the deeper it spread. She remained unyielding. Even her own son, Prince Rakoto, who had received a Western education and favored reform, was kept from power. He pleaded with her to open the kingdom, to welcome new medicine, modern diplomacy. She resisted. To her, these were the soft hands of conquest. She died in 1861, likely from natural causes, at the age of 83. Her funeral was grand, filled with traditional rites, chants, and mourning rituals. No Christian prayers were spoken. Her son, finally crowned as King Radama II, quickly reversed her policies. He reopened relations with Europe, legalized Christianity, and welcomed back foreign advisors. But the imprint of his mother's rule would linger, in stone fortresses, in ancestral festivals, and in the memory of a queen who had refused to kneel. Was Reina Valona high among the worst queens? From the perspective of missionaries and colonial historians, she was monstrous. A villain who slaughtered innocents, burned churches, and drank from the cup of paranoia. But to others, especially nationalists in Madagascar, she is remembered as a protector, one of the last sovereigns who resisted foreign domination with unflinching resolve. Her reign preserved cultural identity, delayed colonization, and asserted a woman's capacity to rule in full. Like many rulers in history, her story is split, not between good and evil, but between fear and preservation, between the pain of power and the cost of holding it too tightly. Tonight, as the winds brush through Madagascar's highlands, across rice terraces and baobab trees, we imagine her throne once more, carved of wood, high above the valley. Empty now. silent. Let her story be told, not just in flames or fear, but in the silence she left behind. An island queen, standing alone against the tide of empire. Let her rest now, not judged, but understood. In the echoing corridors of Constantinople's great palace, where gold mosaics shimmered like frozen sunlight and incense clung to marble colonnades, a woman once ruled with both grace and steel. She sat on the Byzantine throne not as regent, not as consort, but as emperor, crowned and robed in her own right. Her name was Irene of Athens, and she would be remembered not for her piety, her diplomacy, or her devotion to beauty, but for the moment she turned against her own son and carved her legacy in shadow. She came to court as many royal women did, through marriage. In 7069, Irene was chosen as wife to Leo IV, heir to the Byzantine throne. She was young, intelligent, and striking, chosen from Athens for both beauty and political usefulness. But she brought more than elegance to the empire. She brought ambition disguised as obedience. When Leo became emperor in 7075, Irene bore him a son, Constantine VI, and gained the title of empress. Leo's reign was short and troubled. He died just 5 years later and left the throne to his 9-year-old boy. Irene became regent, ruling in her son's name. In the early years, she governed wisely. She balanced the court, soothed rival factions, and strengthened defenses. But beneath the calm, conflict brewed between the powerful iconoclasts, who opposed religious imagery, and the iconodules, who defended the use of sacred icons. Leo had been an iconoclast. Irene was not. In 7087, she convened the Second Council of Nicaea, which restored the veneration of icons across the empire. The decision sparked deep divisions, but it also aligned her with the powerful church establishment and gained support from the West. Still, Constantine VI was growing. By his late teens, the boy emperor grew impatient under his mother's shadow. Irene, elegant and commanding, still issued orders in his name. She signed decrees, made appointments, and maintained the loyalty of the palace guard. Whispers began to circulate that she would never truly give up power. When Constantine finally declared his independent rule in 790, he had his mother confined, briefly sidelining her, but his reign proved fragile. He struggled to command loyalty. Military failures weakened his authority. His decision to divorce and remarry in defiance of church law caused a scandal, losing the support of key bishops and monks. Sensing his vulnerability, Irene returned to court, first in the background, then beside him once more. This time, not as mother, but as equal and rival. By 797, she had rebuilt her network. The palace guards were loyal to her. Ministers spoke in hushed tones of her cleverness. She moved silently, steadily, until one day she struck. In a swift and bloodless coup, her supporters captured Constantine. And then, in the stillness of a September morning, she ordered his eyes put out. Blinding was the Byzantine way of neutralizing a rival without outright execution. But this was no foreign prince or usurping noble. This was her son, the last male heir of the Assyrian dynasty. Some accounts say he died from his wounds. Others claim he lingered for years in silence, kept hidden in a monastery, faceless to the empire. Either way, Irene had removed the final obstacle. Now she ruled alone, not as empress, but as emperor. She took the masculine title Basilius, not Basilissa. Coins were minted, bearing only her name. Her image adorned palace walls, not beside a king, but framed in gold alone. It was unprecedented, it was terrifying, and it did not last. While Irene held court in Constantinople, events in the West were shifting. In 800, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, a move that stunned the Byzantine world. To the Latin Church, the Eastern throne was now vacant, ruled by a woman, which they saw as illegitimate. By crowning Charlemagne, they claimed the imperial legacy for the West. Irene had lost more than her son. She had lost the recognition of empire. Still, She ruled for 5 more years. She attempted to arrange a marriage alliance with Charlemagne, uniting East and West under one crown. But negotiations faltered. Her power waned. Discontent grew among the elite, and in 802 she was overthrown by her finance minister, Nicephorus I. He exiled her to the island of Lesbos, where she lived in relative peace and poverty. Once crowned in purple, she died in simplicity, weaving her own clothes, far from the domes and courtyards of the imperial palace. She was about 70 years old. So why is she remembered among the worst queens? Not because she lacked skill. She was in many ways a capable and shrewd ruler. Not because she failed to govern. She restored icon veneration, brought temporary stability, and balanced a fractured court. No, Irene's legacy darkens because of a single act. She ordered the blinding of her son, a decision that in its cold finality severed her from the natural order of motherhood and monarchy. In the Byzantine imagination, it was more than cruel. It was unnatural, unholy. But history is never that simple. Perhaps she believed Constantine unfit to rule. Perhaps she saw herself as the empire's only hope. Or perhaps beneath the layers of silk and politics, she had simply come too far and could not let go. Tonight, as moonlight touches the stones of Lesbos and waves kiss the forgotten shores where an empress once walked alone, her story still stirs. Not as a warning, not as a legend, but as a reflection of what power demands, of what motherhood breaks, of what history cannot forgive. Let her rest now, not as the woman who blinded her son, but as the ruler who bore a crown too heavy to share. High upon the stone hills of Castile, where the sky opens wide over dusty plains and wind-carved cathedrals whisper of conquest, there once lived a queen whose name reshaped continents. To her people she was La Católica, Isabella the Catholic, a woman of devotion, unity, and enduring will. But history remembers her not only for what she built, but for what she destroyed. Born in 1451, Isabella of Castile entered a Spain divided, kingdoms fractured, nobles warring, religions interwoven in uneasy tolerance. The Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim Iberian land from Muslim rule, was still unfolding. Amid this, she rose not simply as a royal daughter, but as a force of redefinition. Isabella was never meant to be queen. Her half-brother, King Henry I, ruled Castile and promised succession elsewhere. Yet through sharp politics and quiet determination, she maneuvered her way to the throne. In 1469 she married Ferdinand of Aragon, a political union as much as a romantic one. Together, they would become the Catholic monarchs, uniting much of Spain under a single banner. But Isabella's power was never merely symbolic. She was meticulous, educated, and devout. Her court was orderly, her household frugal. She oversaw legal reform, strengthened the treasury, and centralized royal authority. She ruled not behind her husband, but beside him, often taking the lead in court and foreign affairs. Still, beneath her rosary beads and velvet robes, a colder vision stirred, the dream of a pure Christian Spain. This vision was not metaphor. It was policy. In 1478, with papal permission, Isabella and Ferdinand established the Spanish Inquisition, a powerful institution designed to root out heresy among converted Jews and Muslims. Over time, it became a tool of interrogation, torture, and fear. Accused heretics were given trials in secrecy, property was confiscated, families vanished behind stone walls. But for Isabella, the Inquisition was righteous, a necessary measure to protect the soul of the nation. Then, in 1492, a year that would echo far beyond Europe, she enacted one of her most sweeping edicts, the Alhambra Decree. It ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. Tens of thousands fled. Some converted, many did not. Whole communities, with roots deep in Iberian soil, were cast out. Some died in transit, others were robbed or enslaved. Those who remained often lived in fear, forced into silence or exile. Isabella framed it as divine duty. protecting Christian unity. But in truth, it was the dismantling of a vibrant, multicultural society. The same year, another fateful decision was made. An Italian navigator, Christopher Columbus, had sought support for a voyage westward, claiming he could reach the Indies. After years of rejection, Isabella and Ferdinand agreed to fund him. She sold some of her personal jewelry to support the venture, or so legend says. In August 1492, Columbus set sail under the Spanish flag. When he returned with tales of new lands, Isabella's empire expanded beyond anything she had imagined. Her name would become tied to the birth of Spanish America, and with it centuries of conquest, colonization and bloodshed. But in her time, she saw it differently. She believed the lands of the West were part of a divine plan, that native peoples would be converted, kingdoms unified, and the church triumphant. Under her rule, the Spanish crown became the sword of the cross, spreading faith through fire and ink alike. She also sanctioned the creation of missions, the teaching of Christian doctrine, and the regulation of colonization, attempting to balance conquest with morality. Yet the damage was already being done. The arrival of Europeans brought disease, warfare, and slavery to indigenous populations. Entire civilizations such as the Taino and the Aztec would collapse in the shadow of Spain's expansion. Isabella did not live to see it all. She died in 1504, aged 53, after years of declining health. In her final days she remained devout, writing a will filled with religious pledges and moral instructions. She asked to be buried in simple robes, beneath a low tomb, in the chapel of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold she had conquered. And so the queen who unified a nation was laid to rest in the city whose surrender she had orchestrated. Was she among the worst queens? It depends on which legacy you choose. To many Spaniards, she was a saintly figure, disciplined, brilliant, and visionary. She brought political unity, strengthened the monarchy, and set the course for Spain's golden age. To others, her reign marked a turning point toward intolerance. The suppression of diversity, the erasure of Jewish and Muslim presence, the inception of the Inquisition, and the genesis of colonization's darkest chapters. She acted with conviction, but conviction, left unchecked, can become cruelty. Tonight, as the olive trees sway in the Andalusian dusk, and the stone arches of Granada remember her footsteps, we ask not to judge, but to understand. Let her story be remembered, not as a triumph, but as a turning. Not as holy conquest, but as the beginning of a silence that still echoes. Let Queen Isabella rest now, not only as a woman of vision, but as one who mistook unity for purity and paid for it with the soul of a nation. The air in Stockholm carries a particular stillness in winter, soft, bright, and clear, like glass. And in the middle of the 17th century, that northern silence surrounded a royal court, unlike any other. Its queen wore men's boots, studied Latin by candlelight, and openly debated with philosophers while the snow fell outside the palace windows. Her name was Christina of Sweden, and she would be remembered as the queen who abandoned her throne, her crown, and the expectations of an entire kingdom. Christina was born in 1626 under ominous skies. Her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, was a warrior king, the Lion of the North, celebrated across Europe for his victories in the 30 Years' War. But his triumphs were brief. He died in battle the year after her birth, leaving behind an infant daughter and a shaken kingdom. Though some doubted her, the Council of the Realm declared her heir. She would be raised to rule as queen regnant, not as consort. From the very start, Christina was different. Her tutors noted her fierce intelligence and independence. She studied philosophy, languages, astronomy, history. She read Roman poetry and Catholic saints in secret, even as Sweden stood fiercely Protestant. She disdained embroidery and gowns. She walked like a soldier. She insisted on sleeping with swords beside her bed. Observers whispered of her oddness. She once wrote, "I was born with a heart too large for my sex." By the time she assumed full control of the throne in 1644, Sweden was a military power. Her task was to preserve its position, continue its Protestant leadership, and produce an heir to secure the royal bloodline. She did none of those things. Christina had little interest in marriage. Suitors were proposed, Danish princes, German dukes, but she refused them all. When pressured, she claimed she was unfit for marriage. She named her cousin Charles Gustav as her heir and declared that she had no intention of bearing children. At court, Christina created a curious world. She invited thinkers and artists from across Europe. She corresponded with scholars, hosted salons, and patronized the arts. She surrounded herself with musicians, painters, even alchemists. She admired Catholic rituals and Renaissance elegance. For a cold Lutheran court it was strange, even disturbing. But stranger still was her restlessness. She had power, yet it wearied her. She ruled a kingdom, but could not find peace. She began making plans in secret, whispering not of treaties or expansion, but of escape. In 1654, at just 28 years old, Christina stunned her council by abdicating the throne. Her reason? She said she was tired. She declared that ruling was not meant for her. But there was more beneath the surface, a spiritual pull, a hunger for freedom, a quiet rebellion. She left Sweden in disguise, dressed in men's clothes, riding south through the forests and snow, past the borders of her own kingdom and into the world beyond. What awaited her was no ordinary pilgrimage. Later that year, in Innsbruck, she converted to Catholicism, a move that shocked all of Protestant Europe. Sweden had fought wars in defense of the faith. Her father had died protecting it, and now his daughter had turned to Rome. The Vatican welcomed her as a celebrity. She arrived in Rome in 1655, greeted by cardinals and musicians. Papal cities rang with celebration. She was paraded through the streets, the queen who gave up her crown for the true church. But Christina did not stay still for long. She lived lavishly in Rome, hosted cultural salons, and commissioned art and theater. She befriended the sculptor Bernini, funded libraries, and scandalized nobles with her eccentric behavior. Her finances crumbled, she amassed debt, her mood swung, and though she remained a queen in title, she wandered Europe like a figure out of time. At one point, she sought to seize Naples with French support, hoping to crown herself queen once more. The plan failed. Her ambitions faded. She returned to Rome, increasingly isolated, increasingly symbolic. She never married, never returned to Sweden, and never truly explained why she had abandoned it all. Historians have debated her endlessly. Was she a proto-feminist, a mystic, a sexual rebel, a philosopher queen, or merely a restless mind in an era too small for her? She died in 1689, aged 62, in a palazzo in Rome. And then something curious happened again. Despite being a foreigner, a convert, and a queen without a kingdom, she was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, one of only a few women honored in the heart of the Catholic Church. So, was Queen Christina one of the worst queens? Not by failure of governance, not by cruelty or conquest. She did not rule badly, she simply stopped ruling. But for her people, and for the traditions of monarchy, she was a disruption, a mystery, a refusal. She rejected marriage, motherhood, and religious conformity. She abandoned a throne entrusted to her by a grieving nation. And yet, she left behind no war, no torture, no fire, just silence and questions. Tonight, as snow falls softly on the old stones of Uppsala, and the bells of Rome echo faintly across the Tiber, Christina's story remains suspended, somewhere between exile and ascension. Let her rest now, not as a queen who ruled, but as a woman who walked away from crown, from country, from history itself. The air over London once held the scent of smoke, thick, bitter, and final. Not the smoke of hearths or chimneys, but of pyres and of beliefs set alight. In the mid-16th century, as England wavered between faiths and thrones, one queen stood at the center of the storm. Her reign was brief, but her name would echo with sorrow. She was Mary Tudor, remembered by history and by fear as Bloody Mary. But names can mislead, and legacies, like candle flames, flicker more than they burn. Mary was born in 1516, the daughter of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She was a princess born of faith, raised in the Catholic traditions of her Spanish mother, adored by her father, until the great matter of succession unraveled it all. When Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine, the papacy refused. And so the king broke from Rome, creating the Church of England and reshaping the nation's religious fabric. Mary, barely a teenager, was declared illegitimate. Her mother was cast aside, her world fractured. She lived under threat. Her titles were stripped, servants removed. Her health declined. Still, she refused to renounce her mother or her faith. Then came the reign of her half-brother, Edward VI, a devout Protestant. Under his rule, the church moved further from Rome. Latin Mass was banned, relics destroyed, reformers empowered. Mary, ever devout, became a symbol of resistance. Secret masses were held in her chambers. Priests moved quietly in and out. When Edward died in 1553, a new crisis emerged. Protestant nobles feared Mary's return to Catholicism and sought to crown Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, as queen. But the people and many of the nobles turned on them. Mary rode into London triumphant, a red-gold phoenix rising from decades of disgrace. At 37, she became Queen of England and Ireland. The beginning of her reign was filled with hope. Crowds cheered, bells rang. She declared her intent to restore the Catholic faith, but promised no bloodshed. Many believed she would reconcile the old religion with the new world. But Mary was not a ruler made for compromise. She had endured too much, waited too long, prayed too deeply. The pain of her youth had hardened her into something fierce, not cruel by nature, but unyielding in conscience. Her first priority was spiritual restoration. She reinstated Catholic bishops, restored Latin services, and repealed Protestant reforms. Then she sought papal reconciliation, bringing England back into the fold of Rome. But her most infamous decisions were yet to come. In 54, she married Philip II of Spain, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. The union was strategic, meant to bolster Catholic power in Europe, but deeply unpopular. The English feared Spanish dominance, and Philip himself was cold, distant, and politically calculating. Their marriage was more treaty than romance. Then the persecutions began. Between 55 and 155 and 150-58, nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake under Mary's rule. Bishops, ministers, scholars, and commoners alike condemned for refusing to recant. The burnings were public, intended to inspire repentance and fear. Some were carried out with royal hesitation, others with grim resolve, but all were seen and remembered. Mary believed she was saving souls, that her people, led astray, needed purging fire to be reborn in truth. She invoked Old Testament severity, invoked divine justice, invoked pain as purification. But England recoiled. The fires did not convert. They hardened opposition. Protestant writers like John Foxe chronicled the martyrs. Turning suffering into legend, Mary's name became synonymous with blood. Her intentions, however sincere, were buried beneath ash. And all the while, her personal life unraveled. She suffered phantom pregnancies, believing herself with child, only to be met with empty silence. Her body betrayed her. Her people turned cold. Philip left for Spain, disinterested and dismissive. Alone, aging, and still without an heir, Mary fell into despair. In 50-58, after only 5 years on the throne, she died, likely from uterine cancer, in the grey chill of November. She was 42 years old. Her half-sister, Elizabeth, would inherit the throne, ushering in a golden age of Protestant triumph. Mary's Catholic restoration would be reversed. Her name, blackened. Her fires, remembered long after her prayers were forgotten. So was Mary truly among the worst queens? It depends on what one values. She ruled with sincerity, deeply believing that her path was righteous. She restored England to Rome, protected the legitimacy of her mother, and ruled with legal precision. She did not rule for wealth or personal pleasure. She ruled for the soul. But her rigidity, her belief that truth required punishment, led her to martyr hundreds and alienate thousands. Her lack of political instinct, her unpopular marriage, and her tragic inability to produce an heir only deepened the sorrow of her reign. She was not bloodthirsty. She was not vain. She was devout, and that in the age of shifting faiths made her dangerous. Tonight, as the Thames rolls quietly through the capital she once ruled, and the stones of Smithfield lie cold beneath the sky, we remember her not only as Bloody Mary, but as a woman forged in exile, who mistook zeal for justice and burned her legacy in the name of salvation. Let her rest now, not as a villain, but as a candle that burned too hot for a kingdom already ready to change. There are names in history that arrive like whispers, not for their deeds alone, but for the shadows that follow them. Few names carry such velvet infamy as Lucrezia Borgia. Her story, entangled in myth and manipulation, has lived for centuries, not as history, but as suggestion of danger in silk, of beauty masked in poison, of a queen whose throne was gossip and whose kingdom was fear. But behind the veil of rumor lies a woman, shaped not only by scandal, but by the treacherous world into which she was born. Lucrezia was born in 1480, in the heart of Renaissance Rome, to Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal of immense ambition. Her father would soon ascend as Pope Alexander VI, a title meant to carry holiness, though few pontiffs were as steeped in politics and intrigue as he. The Borgia name, by then, was already coated in suspicion, wealth, corruption, nepotism, even whispers of assassination. In this world, Lucrezia became a pawn, prized not for her will but for her value in marriage. Her early years were confined to gilded halls and private tutors. She learned Latin, poetry, music, dance, all the arts expected of a noblewoman. But she also watched, listened, understood, early on, that her fate would not be hers. At just 13, she was married off to a powerful noble, a political alliance arranged by her father and brother, Cesare Borgia, the family's blade in the shadows. But within a few years, the marriage was annulled, its usefulness expired. Some said her husband was too independent. Others said he knew too much. A second marriage followed, to Alfonso of Aragon, a more favorable match, politically. For a time, there was affection between them. They shared letters, music, laughter, but the Borgia court was not a safe place for affection. When Cesare's ambitions shifted, Alfonso became an inconvenience. In 1500, Alfonso was attacked and wounded. While he lay recovering, Cesare's men finished the job, strangling him in his bed. Lucrezia, then just 20, was reportedly devastated. But her mourning was tightly managed. She was removed from Rome, sent to Ferrara, and married again, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara. It was her third marriage, and with it, she stepped into a new role, Duchess. Here, away from Rome's dangerous intrigues, Lucrezia flourished. She founded schools and hospitals. She patronized artists and poets. She became a serious administrator, managing court affairs, navigating local politics, even acting as regent in her husband's absence. In Ferrara, she was not just a duchess. She was respected, even admired. And yet, the legends clung to her: poison rings, secret tunnels, illicit affairs. Some whispered she had borne a child by her own father. Others claimed she kept a vial of arsenic hidden in her jewelry. Her portraits, golden-haired, pale-skinned, unreadable, seemed to invite the imagination. But how much was true? The evidence is scarce. Much of what we know or think we know came from enemies of the Borgias or later writers who favored scandal over truth. In her letters, Lucrezia appears thoughtful, well-read, even devout. She prayed often. She grieved deeply. She bore 8 children, many of whom died young. She wrote poetry. She fell ill often. And when she died in 1519, After complications from childbirth, she was just 39. Her final years were marked by melancholy and loss. She withdrew from court, spent time in convents, and focused on charity. Her husband, once cold and calculating, mourned her deeply. So was Lucrezia Borgia truly among the worst queens. She never ruled a kingdom. She was a duchess, not a sovereign. Her power, borrowed, not claimed, and yet she sits in the gallery of history's wicked women, more fiction than fact. Her sins, if any, remain obscured. What we do know is this: she was born into a world of predators, and made into a symbol for all that frightened the moralists of her time. A beautiful woman with access to power, who moved through courts and councils, not as a victim but as a participant. She survived a father who sold her name, a brother who silenced her husbands, and a culture that feared clever women. Her transformation in Ferrara, from political pawn to respected patron, was not dramatic, but quietly defiant. And perhaps that's what made her so dangerous to the historians who followed. Lucrezia Borgia wasn't wicked because of what she did. She was wicked because of what she represented, a woman who slipped free of the role carved for her and lived anyway. Tonight, as the canals of Ferrara lie still, and ivy climbs the stones of the Este Palace, her name lingers, not as a villain's or a martyr's, but as something more elusive. A question: what if the worst queens were simply misunderstood? Let her rest now, not beneath the weight of legend, but in the silence that history cannot fully explain. In the highlands of Madagascar, where mist rolls gently across rice terraces and the air carries the memory of ancestral drums, there once ruled a queen who held her island in a grip of fear and pride. Her name was Ranavalona. And though her reign would stretch for more than 3 decades, her legacy remains as dense and impenetrable as the jungle that surrounded her. To some, she was a defender of sovereignty, standing firm against European encroachment when other lands were falling to empire. To others, she was a despot, presiding over executions, purges, and labor that turned rivers red. But perhaps the truth is harder and heavier. Ranavalona was not born to rule. She was born in 1778, the daughter of a military official in the powerful Marina Kingdom. Her path to the throne began not through inheritance, but through survival. Her father once saved the life of King Endrian Marina, who would later ensure that his son and Ranavalona would remain close to power. She married Prince Radama, the king's son and heir, and quietly observed the workings of a kingdom in transition. When Radama ascended the throne in 1810, he ushered in an era of modernization. European advisors were welcomed, missionaries established schools, and military training was reformed in the image of Europe. But Radama died young, and without a direct heir. His death left a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped Ranavalona. Through political maneuvering and the swift silencing of rivals, she secured the throne. By 1828, she had declared herself Queen of Madagascar, and what followed was a reign unlike any her island had known before. Ranavalona reversed her husband's policies. She expelled European missionaries, banned Christianity, and reasserted traditional customs. The island, she declared, would not be colonized by culture or canon. It would remain sovereign and sacred. Her methods, however, were extreme. She reintroduced fanamporna, forced labor, as a form of tax. Subjects were sent to build roads, palaces, or serve in the military for weeks or months at a time. Conditions were harsh, many died, but to Ranavalona this was duty to the crown, not cruelty. Christian converts were treated with suspicion. Converts who refused to renounce their faith were executed, sometimes thrown from cliffs, or speared in public rituals. Others were imprisoned, tortured, or sent to remote regions where survival was nearly impossible. Her reign became synonymous with ordeals and purges. One of the most feared was the Tangena ordeal, a traditional practice used to determine guilt. A suspect was forced to consume a poisonous nut, and a series of rituals followed. If they survived, they were declared innocent. If not, guilt was presumed, or irrelevant. Tens of thousands are believed to have died through this method under her rule. And yet, beneath the blood, there was strategy. Ranavalona had watched other African kingdoms fall to European manipulation. She had seen how missionaries softened minds before merchants claimed land. To her, isolation was protection, tradition was defense. Her military campaigns were brutal but effective. She crushed revolts in the east and expanded control across the island. Her armies, though armed with outdated weapons, remained loyal and feared. When the French and British tried to intervene, they were met with resistance and clever diplomacy. Foreign envoys arrived, but left with little. Treaties were rarely signed. Technologies were only adopted if they aligned with tradition. The Queen ruled like a fortress in human form, impermeable and watchful. European observers, frustrated and horrified, labeled her the female Caligula and the Mad Queen of the Tropics. But these were outsiders, imperialists, angry that she would not yield. Still, even among her own people, fear grew. By the 1850s, famine and disease took hold. The burdens of labor, war, and persecution had weakened villages and families. Nobles whispered, advisors plotted, but Ranavalona endured, untouched, unshaken. She ruled until her death in 1861, at the age of 83, a staggering span of time for any monarch, especially one whose enemies had long predicted her fall. And when she died, the kingdom exhaled. Her son and successor, Radama II, reversed her policies almost immediately. He reopened the island to foreign trade and missionaries. He outlawed the Tangier ordeal. He sought modernization once again. But in the quiet after her passing, one truth lingered. Madagascar had remained independent. While vast regions of Africa and Asia were being carved into colonies, she had preserved her island's sovereignty through methods that many would call monstrous, but which had proven, for better or worse, effective. So was Queen Ranavalona. I among the worst queens, by the measure of mercy perhaps, by the cost of life, certainly, but by the preservation of culture, autonomy, and identity, she was unyielding. Her reign is not easily judged. It is not a fable of good and evil. It is a collision between a queen's will and a world hungry to consume her people. She did not kneel. She did not soften. And she did not lose her land. Tonight, in the highlands of Madagascar, where her palaces now sleep under vines and stone, her name still stirs in stories, half feared, half revered. Let her rest now, not as tyrant nor protector, but as the flame that would not bend to the wind even when it scorched her own soil. In the golden halls of Versailles, where mirrors caught candlelight like constellations trapped indoors, the sound of silk once followed a queen through corridors of gossip and expectation. Her name was Marie Antoinette, a name wrapped in pearls and powdered wigs, in opera boxes and whispers behind fans. She was adored, then mocked, then hated, and finally beheaded. To many, she was France's most glamorous queen. To others, its most detached, a symbol not of monarchy, but of its failure to see the storm coming. But Marie Antoinette didn't begin as a villain. She began as a girl far from the palace that would claim her. She was born in 1755, in Vienna, as Maria Antonia Josefa Johanna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Emperor Francis I. Her childhood was one of formality, but also music, laughter, and the refined grandeur of the Habsburg court. At age 14, she was married to the Dauphin of France, Louis Auguste, heir to the French throne. The marriage was not of affection, but of alliance, part of a diplomatic effort to strengthen ties between Austria and France. When she arrived in France, she left everything behind, her name, her clothes, even her dog. She was now Marie Antoinette. Life in Versailles was rigid, alien, and ornate. The French court was obsessed with etiquette. The smallest gesture, glance, or fabric could become scandalous or sacred. Marie struggled at first. Her new husband was shy, bookish, and awkward. Their marriage went unconsummated for years, prompting rumors and ridicule. Lonely, young, and often misunderstood. She began to seek escape, not through politics, but through pleasure. She became known for extravagant gowns, elaborate hairstyles, and costly amusements. She hosted masked balls, gambled, and decorated her private retreat, the Petit Trianon, with a peasant village where she and her friends could play at simplicity, while real farmers outside the palace starved. But to say she was evil is too easy. What she truly was detached. She had little interest in governance. She wrote letters to her family in Vienna, doted on her children, and focused on courtly life. When advisers brought her political matters, she often deferred or avoided. She was not cruel, but in a nation trembling with hunger and unrest, indifference could feel like cruelty. Then came the affair of the diamond necklace, a scandal in which Marie had no actual involvement, but which smeared her reputation beyond repair. A forged letter and a web of deceit convinced many that she had sought to purchase a necklace worth millions of livres during a time of economic despair. Though innocent, the damage was done. The public turned on her, calling her Madame Deficit. Pamphlets portrayed her as a serpent, a seductress, even a traitor. And then came the revolution. By 1789, France was unraveling. The people demanded reform, food, and a voice. The monarchy, isolated in Versailles, responded too slowly. When revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, the world shifted. Marie Antoinette's response was desperate, not calculated. She urged Louis XVI to stand firm, to resist. But resistance came too late. In October of that year, an angry mob marched on Versailles. The royal family was forced to move to Paris, effectively prisoners in their own kingdom. She was no longer a queen in silk. She was now a symbol of everything they wished to destroy. Still, she tried to protect her children, her husband, and her crown. She wrote secret letters to royalists, negotiated in code, and attempted escape. In 1791, the family fled Paris in disguise, hoping to reach loyal troops in the east. But they were recognized and captured in the town of Varennes. From then on, their fates were sealed. Louis XVI was tried and executed in January 1793. Marie Antoinette, now the widow Capet, was kept under strict guard. Her son was taken from her. Her health deteriorated. That October, she was put on trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal. The charges were exaggerated, some entirely fabricated, including accusations of incest with her son. She denied them calmly, but the court was not looking for justice. It was a performance. On October 16, 1793, she was led to the guillotine in a simple white gown, her once famous hair cut short. She did not scream. She did not beg. Her last words were whispered as she stepped on her executioner's foot. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Then, with a single fall of the blade, the monarchy died with her, or so the people believed. Was Marie Antoinette among the worst queens? Not by design, not by malice, but by failure of vision. She was placed in power, never taught to wield it. She was offered a kingdom, but not shown its suffering. Her greatest sin was her distance, a queen who danced while the world starved, who lived in Versailles as if France were not burning. But she was also young, trapped in a role she didn't choose, and betrayed by the very nobility that had trained her to remain quiet. She did not order the death of her people. She did not wish for their hunger. She simply did not see it until it was far too late. Tonight, the palace she once called home still stands, grand, gilded, echoing with footsteps that no longer wear silk. Her story survives in fiction and drama, in legend and in caution. Let her rest now, not as a symbol, but as a soul who lived within the walls of illusion until the truth came crashing in. The morning light over Madrid once fell gently on balconies, hung with crimson banners and golden lions, signaling the rise of a new monarch. But beneath the ceremonial velvet and solemn proclamations stood a queen barely old enough to hold a scepter. Isabella II of Spain was only 3 years old when she inherited the throne. A child monarch born into turmoil, crowned not by readiness, but by necessity. She would reign for 35 years, years marked by court intrigues, military coups, shifting alliances, scandal and war. Yet for all the thunder around her, Isabella would remain curiously unsteady, not a tyrant, not a leader, but a passenger of power, blown by winds she could never command. Her life began in conflict. She was born in 1830, the daughter of King Ferdinand VII, whose reign had already been marred by absolutism and rebellion. Upon her birth, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction, overturning an old law that barred women from inheriting the throne. It was a move made to secure his bloodline and to disinherit his brother Don Carlos. This decision ignited what would become the First Carlist War, a brutal civil conflict between supporters of Isabella and the conservative, traditionalist faction that backed her uncle. Spain fractured into loyalist and Carlist regions, and the infant queen became a symbol of division before she could walk. Her father died when she was just 3. At once she was named Queen of Spain, with her mother, Maria Cristina, acting as regent. For the next decade, Isabella's name was used to justify policy, war, and reform, but she herself remained in the shadows of politics and palace whisperings. At 13, Isabella was declared of age, but while she wore the crown, others held the reins. Her education had been narrow and poorly guided. She was sheltered from real discussion, surrounded by conflicting advisers and factions, many of whom saw her more as a puppet than a sovereign. She was bright, but not trained, sensitive, but unprepared. Her early reign was already spiraling. In 1846, a marriage was arranged to her double first cousin, Francis of Cadiz, in a move meant to consolidate the dynasty. But the marriage was a disaster. Francis was described as effeminate and cold, and their relationship quickly deteriorated. The union became a source of public gossip, whispers of affairs, estrangement, and children, whose paternity was quietly debated in court circles. Meanwhile, Spain's political structure was crumbling beneath her. Liberal and conservative factions clashed constantly, resulting in frequent changes of government, coups, and street violence. Prime ministers came and went. The army gained increasing influence, corruption flourished, and Isabella, now a young woman, struggled to define her place in the chaos. Rather than steer her kingdom toward calm, Isabella often deepened instability. She relied heavily on personal favoritism, granting power and titles to those she trusted or those who flattered her. Her court became notorious for nepotism, and her ministers often ruled more by loyalty than ability. The queen's personal life, too, became entangled in scandal. She was known for her romantic liaisons, some whispered to be with military officers, others with court ladies. Her passions were volatile. Friendships collapsed into hatred, and favorites fell swiftly. The court became a stage of jealousy, betrayal, and rumor, where politics blurred with private drama. But despite the instability, she endured. Spain, though wounded, did not collapse. Reforms came and went. Revolts flared and faded. Isabella presided over railways being built, laws being passed, colonies being managed. Though often at arm's length, she was not absent but ineffective, a queen who signed documents without reading them, who appeared in public ceremonies but avoided deeper governance. By the 1860s, discontent had grown. The army, disillusioned, the liberals, frustrated, the people, weary. In 1868, a revolution erupted, known as the Glorious Revolution. Isabella, now nearly 40, found herself without allies. The military turned. The crowds cheered her departure. She fled to France with her family and lived in exile. Her abdication was not formalized until 1870, when she passed the claim to her son Alfonso. Her departure marked the end of a royal chapter, but not of the monarchy itself. Spain would falter, then restore the crown, then falter again. But Isabella, the girl queen who had grown old beneath the weight of a crown she never quite carried, had left the stage. She lived quietly in Paris for the rest of her life, watching her son become king and Spain attempt stability once more. She died in 1904, far from the palaces of her youth. So was Isabella II among the worst queens, not in cruelty, not in tyranny, but in neglect, in misjudgment. She was placed upon a throne when she should have been playing in gardens. She was married for alliance, not love. Surrounded by flatterers, hemmed in by chaos, and trained in almost nothing beyond formality, she became a monarch without direction. Spain during her reign did not flourish. It faltered, and while she did not cause every failure, she did little to prevent them. Yet to blame her alone is to ignore the deeper fracture of a monarchy unfit for its time, of a nation caught between modernity and nostalgia, and of a child made queen long before she understood the world she was asked to rule. Tonight, as the streets of Madrid pulse with modern life, and the royal flag flutters above the Palacio Real, her name remains carved into history's quieter footnotes, not as a tyrant, nor a reformer, but as a lost monarch, drifting through the wreckage of a kingdom she never truly led. Let her rest now, not beneath judgment, but beneath the gentle weight of time, which softens all crowns and silences all thrones. The scrolls of Chinese history are vast, patient and meticulous, woven with dynasties, sages and emperors, and among their lines, beneath the weight of 1,000 years of Confucian judgment, sits one woman who defied them all, Wu Zetian, the first and only woman to rule China in her own name, carved her legacy into stone, not as a consort or dowager, but as emperor. Her rise was improbable, her reign extraordinary, and her methods unforgiving. To many historians she was cunning, ruthless, even cruel, but to others she was brilliant, a reformer, a scholar, and a protector of stability in an age of decline. Wu Zetian was born in 64 CE, during the Tang dynasty, to a wealthy and influential family. Her father, a military commander, ensured she received an education unusual for girls of her time. She read history and philosophy, wrote poetry, and studied the classics, quietly preparing for a world that would resist her at every turn. At the age of 14, she entered the imperial court as a concubine to Emperor Taizong. She held a minor position at first, serving in relative obscurity, but even then, those who observed her described a girl of striking intelligence and calm observation. When the emperor died, she was sent as custom dictated to a Buddhist convent. Most women in her position would have faded into silence, but Wu returned. She had caught the eye of Prince Li Ji, Taizong's son and successor. When he became Emperor Gaozong, he brought her back to court, not just as a consort, but as a political partner. From that moment forward, Wu Zetian's rise became unstoppable. She swiftly outmaneuvered rivals in the harem, including Empress Wang and other favored concubines. Stories, some exaggerated, others plausible, spread of false accusations, strategic poisonings, even the death of her own infant daughter, blamed on her enemies to justify their removal. One by one, her rivals fell. By 65 she was declared Empress Consort, the highest woman in the empire. But Wu was not content to influence policy from behind silk screens. As her husband's health declined, she assumed more control, drafting edicts, meeting ministers, and making decisions in his name. When Emperor Gaozong died in 6083, the true test began. Rather than retreat into widowhood, Wu maneuvered her way to the throne itself through a series of calculated moves, including the deposition of her own sons. She declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, with herself as emperor, not empress, not regent, emperor. It was a title no woman had ever claimed in China. It required rewriting the rituals, the symbols, the celestial justification for rule. Wu did it all. She declared that even heaven itself supported her reign, and for 15 years she ruled, not through her sons or her husbands, but entirely in her own name. She governed with skill and vision. Under Wu Zetian, the imperial examination system was expanded, opening doors to talented men from lower social classes. Agriculture was strengthened. Corruption, though present, was monitored. Infrastructure improved. Buddhism flourished under her patronage. with great temples rising and sacred texts sponsored. She surrounded herself with loyal officials, often outsiders or those previously excluded from power, and used them to dismantle aristocratic resistance. She fostered diplomacy with neighboring states and crushed rebellions with military force. But her methods were brutal. Her secret police were notorious. Dissenters were tortured, exiled, or executed. Critics vanished, surveillance thrived, loyalty was rewarded, but betrayal or the mere suspicion of it invited swift punishment. She was not just a ruler. She was a force, cold and exacting, and she was never forgiven for it. Traditional historians, steeped in Confucian ideals, reviled her. To them, a woman ruling meant disorder in the natural order. They painted her legacy in blood, tales of manipulation, arrogance, sexual excess, and moral decay. But time paints with broader strokes. Wu Zetian was a woman who seized power in a world designed to keep her voiceless. She ruled a vast empire in an age when most women could not read. She created stability in a time of succession crises. She governed, reformed, and left behind a record of effective if severe leadership. Toward the end of her life, age and illness softened her hold. Court intrigues returned. Factions pushed her to restore her son as heir, and in 705 CE, under pressure, she abdicated quietly, returning power to the Tang line. She died later that year, at the age of 81. At her tomb on Mount Lang, a giant stone stele was erected, unusually blank. No words, no titles, no summary of her reign, just silence. Perhaps because no words could agree. Was she a usurper, a murderer, a reformer, a visionary? Or was she simply a woman who, when the gates of power stood shut, broke them down? So was Wu Zetian one of history's worst queens? Only if power itself is a crime. Only if strength, in a woman's hands, becomes an unforgivable offense. She ruled with an iron will and a poet's mind. She committed terrible acts, but few beyond what male emperors were routinely forgiven. And unlike many of them, she left her empire stronger than she found it. Tonight, as the mists settle over Xi'an and the quiet stones of her mausoleum absorb the passing centuries, her name lingers, not in judgment, but in awe. Let her rest now, not as a warning, but as a question. What does it mean to rule? And who, after all, gets to decide? Which throne is too high for a woman to climb?